Good evening, and call to order the May meeting of the Lawrence Douglas County Metropolitan Planning Commission. And for first action, we have some minutes to receive. We do not have the February minutes, but we have March minutes. Do we have a motion to approve or any amendments? Go ahead, Commissioner Carter. Okay. We have a motion and a second to approve the minutes. It's a silent one. Any changes? All in favor? And opposed? Or 9-0. And how about the April minutes? Thank you. Do we have a second? All right. Any amendments or changes? All right, all in favor? And opposed? We're 9-0 again. Committee reports. Do we have any committees that met over the past month? Communications. We have any written communications from the public?
Just what was posted.
Okay.
I'm not sure yes, we did add some communications related to the comprehensive plan. And then we also added a staff memo that we provided to the Affordable Housing Advisory Board earlier this month, just making sure that you see sort of the cross-pollination of discussions related to Plan 2040.
Thank you. Also, we had a memo in our packet on fracking and injection wells. Would that also be considered a written communication from staff? It's not mentioned in the agenda.
It's under the comp plan item, since it was related to that.
Okay, thank you. Any other written communications from planning commissioners or other commissioners?
No.
All right. How about any written action of waiver requests or determinations by the city engineer?
No.
Disclosure of ex parte communications. This time we ask any planning commissioners who've had a discussion about the items on our agenda, which number 1, to disclose those conversations that they had.
Actually, this is for an item that's not on our agenda, but will be coming back. It was in reference to the text amendment for affordable housing. I met with Rebecca Buford of Tenants to Homeowners, and I can provide details of that meeting when that subject comes up again.
Okay, thank you. Any other ex parte communications? Any declarations of abstentions from specific agenda items? I hope not. Okay. We also have a time at the beginning of our meeting for general public comment, and that's if you came to discuss something that is not an item on our agenda, we give 3 minutes to any member of the public who would like to address us for general public comment. Is anyone here for that? Okay. Seeing none, we move to our regular agenda where we have 1 item, which will be our comprehensive plan. And we're tackling 2 chapters today, which are the community resources and the appendix. As always, we welcome, we will be hearing from staff. Do we have a staff report for these chapters?
Briefly.
Okay, so let's go ahead and have that. Thank you.
Good evening, Commission. Jeff Crick with the City County Planning Office. I will try to be brief since I know we have a lot to cover. I will be talking about community resources in the appendix chapter tonight, and I wanted to kind of speak about those 2 because they're a little bit of a new creation in the way the document works. Community resources is actually a combination of some of the other chapters put together for historic resources, parks, rec, and open space, community facilities, and including 2 new chapters, the arts and culture chapter and also the food system development chapter. So those last 2, they're very new to the document. The steering committee felt it very important to move them into it. The appendix will be one of them that also come up. Just to give you a kind of a little bit of background and the reason to the why for the appendix, it's kind of the collection of things that you saw scattered throughout Horizon 2020. So what was the demographics chapter has been moved to the appendix to allow us to update it for the upcoming Census 2020 update that will be occurring. It also is a way of us to kind of carry Chapter 14 forward into the new document. Chapter 14 covers what we call the specific land use plans. It's the sector plans, the neighborhood plans that you saw in 14, just migrating their way over. We're also introducing a chapter in there called reference plans. So it's plans that really speak and have an introduction to land use items, but they don't necessarily have full land use components. Think of the Affordable Housing Advisory Board's recent study or the food system plan and some of those other ones. They have land use components, but they're not fully land use plans in the same way that the Northeast Sector Plan is. Then we also have the implementation section. I do want to spend a minute just to kind of give you an idea of what this implementation section is supposed to do and just kind of what it is lined out to really become. Implementation is meant to be a tracking area, kind of where people can very quickly turn to find out what the status of a certain goal or an action item is, find out, is it in progress, has it been completed, has it been held up, what is the details to it, and if it is completed, when was it completed? Provide some of that background, so it's kind of a very quick synopsis to it. It's important to keep in mind that the implementation section is not prioritized. That is done by the governing bodies and yourselves as we start doing the annual work plans. This is really just a flexible catch-all to kind of give a very quick overview of what has occurred since the plan has been adopted. That annual work plan would be something that we'd bring before you and the governing bodies to line up, and that would guide us on what policies we would start working on kind of going forward from there. That is really a very opening crash course on all that stuff there. I'd be glad to stand for any questions you have at this time.
Thank you. We will have questions at some point. So at this point, we open up to the community, and we've been giving public comment 5 minutes for each individual on the comprehensive plan, just to get a little bit more depth in the discussion. And also, we have welcomed discussion on from the public on any aspect of the plan. However, our discussion will be only the 2 chapters that were listed, the community resources and the appendix. But you're welcome to address us on any topic of the comprehensive plan. So who would like to start?
Good evening, Commissioners. I'm Danielle Davy with the Lawrence Board of Realtors. I had submitted some additional materials to you all last Friday, and in particular a chart which I thought was really illustrative of the gap in the housing availability in our community. I don't want to spend a lot of time on it because I know you've all heard my position before, but I do just want to reiterate our concern that the community benefit policy in Chapter 2 is going to exacerbate that gap in the availability of housing in our community and make it harder to develop that 250 or below housing that our community needs. I have read the other chapters in Plan 2040, and in particular with the community resources chapter that you're looking at tonight. One thing that jumped out at me is that with regard to the historic resources, that section of the chapter you're looking at tonight, the word incentive or incentivize is used 8 times just in regard to that one topic. And I thought that was interesting because I thought that was something of an acknowledgement that incentives can be a powerful source of driving behavior or meeting community goals. And that's what we would like to see the language in Chapter 2 move to, is more to an incentive-based program rather than that restrictive shall-only language in 2.2 that we've looked at a couple times before. So, thank you.
Thank you. I'll ask you to sign in with your name also.
Sure.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Kim Kreiner. I'm chair of the Douglas County Food Policy Council. You've received our letter explaining our suggested edits to the Chapter 7, Section E about food systems development. In its current form, as written, the bolded Strategy 1 is very economically focused and does not adequately represent the diverse value that the food system provides to our community. So we propose to add separate goal statements that holistically express the function of our food system that contributes to health, wealth, and resilience. Furthermore, we want to specifically call on existing planning tools such as the Food Systems Plan, which came out, which was created out of this comp plan process, climate adaptation and open spaces plan, both for cohesion and to reduce duplication. And lastly, we want to emphasize the impact that planning can have on food access and culturally diverse options for our community, and want to offer the opportunity for you to ask any questions about our suggested edits. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm Courtney Shipley. This is with regard to the community resources part. And I and another group, the Oak Hill Cemetery group, has been in discussions with Parks and Rec about this, but everyone seems to kind of forget that we're in charge of cemeteries. And even when you look at the Parks and Rec master plan, it is mentioned 0 times in 60 pages. And it also touches on questions of sustainability, because if you know very much about what happens in a traditional burial, there's a concrete vault, there's, which by the way, in case you're curious, I like these statistics myself, 13,000 tons of steel per year are used in, 1.5 million tons of concrete. We can make changes to the way we do things in our cemeteries. We just don't think about it because it's sort of combines 2 things that aren't sexy, which is death and municipal funding. So I just like to point that out. And then also, for those of you that are very interested in sustainability, of course, like something we're in the neighborhood of 30% of people do cremation, which is great, except that does also generate 250,000 tons of CO2, which is like 41,000 cars per year of exhaust. So it's really not as sustainable as we think it is, and people are learning about this and they're asking more for green burials and things like that. And so there are some changes we could be making and some plans that we could be making for the future with our cemeteries. And I'm not meaning to come up on Parks and Rec because they already know I've talked to them. But just to make information available to you guys, we've talked about the columbariums before. People just don't think about these things. They get forgotten very easily, and I just wanted to bring them up. I don't know where it would go. I don't know if it would go in the Parks and Rec area or if it would go in the sustainability area, but it's certainly something we need to think about because for the foreseeable future, the number of deaths per person will be 1. And, 120,000 people live here. We're gaining 1,000 people a year. So I just wanted to bring this to your attention that it is something that is easily forgotten, but very important to people. Thank you.
Thank you. Who would like to follow that? Do we have any other takers? We've got some other voices out there. Does anybody else want to speak? Okay. Well, with that, we close the public comment portion. We may yet have questions for those of you who spoke, but we will bring it back up to the commission for discussion. And how we've been tackling these chapters is to go first to the sidebars and talk about definitions and advisory boards. As we do that, we'll note that the community resources chapter is broken up into sections A through E. And so the advisory boards listed in the sidebar there on the first page only apply to section A. So we'll get other advisory boards with the other topics. So looking only at topic A, historic resources, in the sidebars, do we have any comments, suggestions, additions? I have a couple. We've got a couple of great historic buildings from Baldwin in the photos, which is great. They're part of the county, but they're not really covered by this plan. Does that matter? I mean, the city of Baldwin isn't covered by the plan, but many of the community resources from the county then would include that. So
we've tried to pick photos. We received some from HCC and other organizations to kind of work from. So we didn't have a great pool to start with, but we figured they are historic resources. Most of the buildings, to my knowledge, are either on the National or State Register of Historic Places, so that's why we included them in.
okay. I will have a couple of suggestions possibly for definitions we might want to put in the sidebar, but maybe we'll wait till we get to those in the text and then see if other people feel like that's helpful or useful. So any other comments on advisory boards, design guidelines, demolition by neglect, what is a certified local government, or anything else in the sidebars? All right, with that, we'll start into the vision statement of historic resources. And again, I have a comment on the very first line. And that's that the grammatically correct would be no apostrophe S after city when two entities own the same item. The apostrophe S goes only after the second one. Sorry, and that's actually a couple times in the chapter. So. Any substantive comments on the vision statement? Goals. Goal number 1.
I have something at the end of that. Somebody has an earlier goal.
You're first.
1.9.
Okay.
Just mostly a question. It says evaluate all structures over 50 years old for their historic significance. By evaluating, what exactly does that mean? How would evaluation be triggered, as in everything since 1970 going to be evaluated, and how is that done?
Typically, it's done, it can happen a couple of different ways, but it's usually done on a case-by-case basis depending upon what's coming forward. Sometimes applicants will ask people to come out and take a look just to evaluate the structure for the historic significance for a tax credit project or something that they have going on. Other times it's part of it, they want to know about that as part of the selling of a property to find out the details to it. So it can be triggered in many different ways depending upon where it is.
So, and I would just add, so 50 years is sort of the trigger of historic nature, where it may be eligible for landmarking. And we actually had a pretty good discussion at the steering committee that the steering committee didn't want to set up necessarily a new layer of process, okay? But so this wording came out of that discussion to, especially the part where we're educating owners on ways it could be protected as an asset, because there are some benefits if you're an eligible property that there's a financial benefit in remodeling, renovation that could be had. So it's one way, that education component is one way to protect historic resources versus creating a formal process of, delaying building permits while we go through some formal evaluation.
When I read evaluate, that's what leaped to mind, is that it was some formal process.
Yeah, and recall, this is the high level
Okay.
policy, and so we
Okay.
would have to develop what that actually becomes later.
We don't have anyone here from the Historic Resource Council,
No.
which we have had in the past meetings, because I was going to ask that again, and we did talk about that at the steering committee. I think there's some, funding availability and everything kind of centers on this 50-year idea. I don't think the idea is that every building from 1970 is to be preserved in our community forever, but just that that's the trigger date,
Okay.
so. Anybody else have any questions about that, concerns? Any other things on goal number 1? Goal number 2? So since I did sit on the steering committee, I've gotten one pass through all of this document, and when you read it the first time, many things seem just great or fine, and because we're looking at, yes, we value these things as a community. When you look at the whole document again as a whole, you start to see that it's not just that we value certain things, it's that we value competing things, and we have to hold those in tension. I think this goal number 2, when it talks about conserve and protect the visual context of historic resources, and all the items that fall under that, are great for that we do value our historic resources. It doesn't give future governing bodies any way to hold in tension this idea that we need to grow and change as a community, value density, and that those things are going to happen within our historic city boundaries and neighborhoods. And that concerns me a little bit, that we haven't, that this chapter, this portion of the chapter doesn't really give any context for that for future governing bodies to work those things out. It's only in support of what is historic and not in support of what our community might need that is new. So kind of I don't have a specific suggestion yet, just kind of keep that in mind as we read through some of the issues on this item number 2. Conserve and protect the visual context of historic resources. And that's that really high level goal. I think it can be a slippery slope. I think maybe we saw that somewhat with the hub, that we don't know how much of a visual context or how far that spans. So I have a little concern over that. We else have any comments on item 2, or shall I go
I
on?
just have some
ahead.
questions. I was reading the, excuse me, demolition by neglect, and I just wanted to know a little bit more about that, because from what very little I know, it seems like there could be some risk there for historic structures, so I just kind of wanted to understand that a little bit better.
Well, in terms of demolition by neglect, it's when a property owner neglects the property, doesn't maintain it well enough, doesn't keep it sealed up from the elements. And while we have property maintenance codes that address much of those things, it's still it's creep. So it's scope creep over time. Little holes let a lot of water in, and we may not know it's an issue until it's almost neglected to the point of having to be demolished. And that can affect historic assets or potential historic assets that may have a value in preserving and protecting, and also may have impacts in terms of, turnover from that history to something new and different. So that's the discussion around demolition by neglect. We're trying to strengthen our codes actually now to be bolder about addressing it in the early stages instead of letting it progress so late. Am I answering your question?
No, I mean, kind of, but I guess how does that prevent, if we have it sounds like, we have something now, but implement a demolition by neglect ordinance to protect significant historic structures from neglect. I guess I want to know a little bit more about how that protects them. Other than...
Because it physically, if owners are required to maintain their property at appropriate levels, it keeps it tightened up. It doesn't let the wind, water, rodents, infestations in the property. Not every historic property or potential historic property has a viewpoint of protection and preservation. And where the community, through our codes and policies, may have a very strong general value for protection and preservation. So it's attempting to get at that issue of owner neglect, really any property we need to, I think, do a little bit better job of, because it's affecting potentially the affordable housing base, neighborhood patterns where you end up with demolished houses and there's a missing tooth in the pattern of a block. And so there are a lot of values related to reducing demolition by neglect. But that's how we're addressing part of it from the historic preservation side of it, is to reduce it.
So the idea is that has sort of measures to keep that from happening in that development of that along the way, rather
Correct.
than just here's what we do once it's
right. The way it works in practice is if you are in a historic district, for example, and you come in and want to demolish your property, you're required to go through the Historic Resources Commission. There first has to be a physical assessment of that property to see if it's structurally sound. And if it is, the first thing that our codes and policies will attempt to do is preserve it for the sake of the historic district. Well, sometimes it's been neglected for so long, and the neglect has deteriorated the structure so poorly, so much, that it can't be saved. That's what we're trying to address.
How will you know it's occurring?
Well, it's tough, right? It's hard. Vacancy is one indicator, though. Property maintenance that you can see from the public way, complaints we receive on it from rodent infestations and tall weeds and those kinds of things are indicators. So, but it's not as rare as you might think that we get an issue coming in that has been neglected for so long that it's not worth saving.
So is the intention that all buildings are worth saving and that, I mean, at some point,
Well,
some buildings do go away to make room for
Sure.
other buildings?
all property ownership has a certain amount of responsibility in the view of the codes. So all buildings are worth maintaining, right? For all the values that have to do with neighborhood impact and,
City of Lawrence. Are you talking about the county also?
County also.
well, in my opinion,
Okay.
all properties should be maintained at a certain level, certain minimal level, but when you put the historic value in there and you know, the people and community have worked hard to create a district or a landmark property, it gets at a higher level of preservation value.
I guess maybe I see implemented demolition by neglect ordinance protects significant historic structures from neglect, significant historic structures. I mean,
Okay.
I can appreciate that.
Not all.
But I still, I just, I mean, I guess I'm getting upper level here, but, you know, just curious as to how that all pans out to protect those structures from being neglected, you know, that part of it, rather than sort of the after they already are.
Well, you're right, yeah, it would have to begin to be neglected in order to take action. Although, like we just talked about, there are education components that we always struggle to find time and resources to do more of. That might be able to help in some of that regard as well. If people understood that there are positive, I mean, obviously there are positive benefits to preserving historic assets, but there may be more than people even know if you look at historic tax credits and things.
Commissioner Struckoff.
And I know we're at a very high level here, and the demolition by neglect ordinance ideas is, it seems a little bit specific, and I don't have a problem with it, but I was wondering about, we'd spoken a while back about things like grading permits. We had a property that had taken out a lot of trees that were providing an important buffer for neighbors. And is that the kind of thing that we would also think about? Do we have a preservation? I know in Chapter 4 it talks about incentivizing preservation of lands and things like that, but that kind of, those are farmlands and more preservation of agricultural lands. And I was just wondering where that might fit into the demolition idea in general.
Yes, some of that may show up as outcomes of the natural resources chapter, specifically in around the protection of sensitive lands.
Right.
So, and we are actually looking at a program of grading permits for a number of different reasons. Soil erosion control, destruction of sensitive lands are two of the highest priorities, values around that.
Thanks.
I have a comment on 2.4, and it has list eligible properties to state, local, or national registers for historic places. And I suggest maybe say support property owners who want to list eligible properties, because it's all with the wishes of the property owner, is it not? I mean, it's not something that we would have any authority of outside of that. So that's the language I would propose, would be support property owners who want to list eligible properties to the local, state, and national registers of historic places.
Although sometimes there can be a lot of pushback
From
neighbors who do not wish properties to be listed. So I don't know if if we can have a policy of supporting one side over the other.
I guess I don't know of instances of pushback, right, so.
Lawrence is a bit unique in that we have what the term is environmental, environs review. It's a context, goes out 250 feet from the landmark property. Actually, the hub went through the environs review, in fact. The state used to have a similar review that went out 500 feet from the property, and the legislature stripped that process, that review, away statewide. And so for state law review, we don't do that review anymore. So we had, one of the discussion points that comes up in landmarking on the local register is that issue that what effect does it have on my property if I'm in that environs of 250 feet? And so that's the only way really that a landowner outside of the actual property being landmarked could be impacted.
I see. So in terms of, I wish we had someone from Historic Resources here to kind of talk, I know they've done a lot of work on identifying places that could be listed on registers. What would you suggest for
I don't know, it just struck me as
Policy.
that supporting, I mean, as much as I think we should support historic resources, I just wondered if that put us in the position of,
possibly?
or sort of taking sides on these issues before a particular amenity, a particular structure, a particular item would come before, and I don't know. if
I'd
that's
observe,
true.
though, that it says eligible
Yes.
properties,
So,
so, you know,
Mhm.
yeah,
Mhm.
I think this whole
Mhm.
section kind of
Mhm.
chooses sides in the sense that it's
Mhm.
advocating for the preservation of historic resources, so.
Quite strongly, I mean, it suggests that we should list those properties,
Mhm.
and we don't actually have any control over that as any of the entities that would be operating under this document.
I support the language you
Mhm.
propose. To support property
Support
owners who
property
want
owners.
to list their eligible
Yeah.
properties.
And you think the eligible is enough to give
It has to go through
neighborhoods
a
some
review,
suggestion?
right? I mean, it's not,
Well, for the local landmark, it does.
We don't know about state and national.
I guess they all go through Historic Resources Commission.
There's
And-
varying levels depending upon federal, state, and local, and the different thresholds they hit, so they all have a review process.
And that includes some kind of neighborhood input also within that 250-foot radius, or do we know?
Usually for state and national, there is a notice that's sent out, but it's not in the same context that we would use it or see it
Mhm.
as, but for ours, it was a notice that would be sent through.
Okay. So we have the suggested language, do we want to see any changes to that? Okay. Number 2.5, we have expand the use of overlay districts and design guidelines to enhance the unique places in our community. And I, for having sat here for a couple of years, have still not had a lot to do with the design guidelines, and the Oriad neighborhood design guidelines came through just as I was brand new and had really no context for it. But even then, I wasn't sure, is this really helpful or harmful to the long term of that neighborhood? I know that there was great community interest in seeing the preservation of, and through the design guidelines, but I wasn't sure what that did overall about gentrification and affordable housing and some of those other pieces. Does anybody have any better insight than I have on the long-term effects of design guidelines and overlay districts? Or staff?
They're generally something that a neighborhood has asked for, because they're getting at their value is in making sure that the historic pattern of the neighborhood and the elements, I would say, you could almost say the good elements of the neighborhood are carried forward into the future. And so it's a little bit a tool, it's a zoning tool, used for architectural review and pattern development more than anything.
I think the Oriad guidelines were, when we talked about neighborhoods before, it's a sense of place, and they were losing that sense of place. They were losing that historic pattern of what there was by having single-family residences being combined in lots and turning into mega 8-bedroom duplexes with inadequate parking, and they were seeing the very character of their neighborhood change, which is what prompted the start of those many years ago. I think by the time I got here, it'd been in process for 10 years. So now we're in the from when the neighborhood first brought it up.
Well, we first did a neighborhood plan. One of the action steps was design guidelines. We had to wait for funding to hire a consultant to do it, because you don't just the first step in design guidelines is assessing what the pattern is to start with. And what that pattern was in what we call a period of significance, the historic period of significance. And once you make that assessment, then you have to determine what guidelines to build, whether or not there are singular houses with porches and voids on the side and the figure ground patterns and fenestration issues and roof pitch and style. All of that goes into the development of the guidelines. And then the ORIAD, for example, had 5 different areas, 5 different subsets of the guidelines speak to things like lot consolidation. Where should a block maintain its 50-foot individual lots, and where should they be consolidated into a more massive lot for something like the HERE project? All of that goes into it. It's very in-depth, pretty technical, very involved, takes quite a while to develop and get through the process. All along, though, it's looking at that neighborhood, very context-based, very specific, to keep that historic period of significance in mind into the future.
And within that context, does it allow for increased density in places?
In places, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, and so, for example, in ORIAD, we determined through the public process where the higher density lot consolidation would, and it basically lined up with KU, right, just on the edge of KU. The HERE project, for example, really reflected the values of what the ORIAD neighborhood plan and the design, not the design guidelines, I'm sorry. It actually was submitted before the guidelines were adopted. Had the guidelines been adopted and applied, it would look very different, very much different than it does today.
Mm-hmm.
But in terms of density and mixed use, it reflects the neighborhood plan pretty well.
So expanding the use of those, you don't see any problems with that between our future affordable housing efforts and that
No,
sort of thing?
because it could be used as a tool to address some of that, for example. One of the concerns with gentrification are the McMansions in a context that hasn't historically supported and accommodated very large homes in terms of replacement homes. It's a tool that you could use and establish to address some of those issues.
Okay.
So that actually makes me wonder about 2.6. So what's the difference with the conservation district and some of these in a historic overlay?
Mm-hmm.
What more different protections does that offer?
There's a distinction between
Yeah.
historic districts and guidelines. Historic districts are governed by the National Park Service guidelines. Correct me when I'm wrong. So even within ORIAD design guidelines, we have 2 historic districts that are noted as being governed by state law review. We didn't have to reinvent guidelines for those areas. They're already governed by historic criteria.
So a conservation district would be something different that the city would then, it would be there would be new guidelines. This is 2.6. Create conservation districts to protect historic environs.
We do already have an entity called the Douglas County Conservation District, which is an entirely different entity. So that was one of those definitions I say, I don't get it. I'd like to see it.
It's a very specific terminology in historic preservation. A conservation district is where the properties themselves individually may not rise to the level, but as a whole, they become important. I think great examples of these are, mill villages in certain places where you have that old properties where there was a mill and a town developed around the mill. Well, the houses themselves may not be specific, but the totality of them is very important. So it's a very broader neighborhood-wide look at some of the properties. So it has a very specific terminology and carry. It does mimic a little bit what you hear as the conservation, those things, but it's really meant for the buildings in that sense there. So it doesn't necessarily have to rise to the level of a historic district at the state and the federal level, but it might be something that's desired at the community level to preserve a context area.
An overlay district doesn't necessarily have to be a historic district. So they're two different things.
Would that be a great sidebar or what? That definition you just gave us on the conservation districts, I'd like to see that kind of fleshed out, because it wasn't
I
a
think there would be-
terminology.
Yeah, there would be questions. I
Yeah.
didn't know the difference.
And for this plan, would that have to also include the difference between a county conservation district?
I think it could be a standalone definition, but to me, that is a bit of a conflict, because I know the other entity, but may not be as well
I mean, for
known.
the sake of people who know that, what that is and see this conservation
Right.
district, you know.
Since one of our commissioners worked there,
Just an idea.
I would leave that to Jeff to handle that. Any other points on, we've made it as far as 2.6? Actually, we've covered 2.7. On 2.8, can you explain, adopt rehabilitation, building, and fire codes? Can you explain
Usually
that to me?
there's guidelines, and International Fire Code, the International Building Code, and they're very prescriptive about how certain things can occur, which sometimes don't work or work well with a historic building or historic property. There is alternate guidelines that cities can create and adopt, to where you still meet the intent of the building code and the fire code, but it gives leeway to allow the historic structure to maintain the integrity and maintain the assets that make it unique. So it's a little bit of an add-on that you would tack into those different codes to kind of give it help, so you're not adding something that may be detrimental to the structure in the long term.
And we currently don't have anything for historic structures?
I
We
think
just
there's
have
some of it
one
in the
fire
building
code?
code. It'd be something we'd want to explore a little bit.
Okay, thank you.
Little bit more.
Any other comments on point number 2? Other than the 2.1 that says encourage infill development that's compatible with historic patterns and styles, and it talks about encouraging infill development, do we feel like this chapter gives us any guidance in terms of balance between new developments in a neighborhood and historic neighborhood patterns? I think they're both values we've talked about through the document. How do we balance those?
I personally don't see a conflict here. I mean, because I think, as I said earlier, the point of this section is to preserve historic resources. It's not to find a balance per se. Elsewhere in the document, we express a preference for infill development. But I don't think that's in conflict with historic resources either, because it's not saying demolish historic resources in order to allow infill development.
Right.
I think implicitly, I think the balance is implicitly there.
So even though it's not both values in this chapter, they're saying that because the infill value is earlier in the document, that's sufficient?
Yeah, I personally don't see a tension.
Okay.
No, I agree with that. I mean, what we're talking about, I think that primarily what we're talking about is the older sections of towns where we have environs already, and most of these infill, what's gonna happen in those areas is gonna be going through historic resources to make sure it is compatible. So we don't get, I guess it's more like what ORIAD design guidelines have done, is it fits in a historic pattern. We don't have that in all places, so we're getting some odd ones over in East Lawrence right now, with additions to homes that are, multiple architectural styles, but, we'll see where it goes. I mean, we're in an experiment, really, with the ORIAD design guidelines.
Well, and I would turn your attention on page 21 of the plan, where we talk about within Lawrence Tier 1 development, we've got a goal 8 there, to integrate higher density residential development to be an asset, and we're encouraging integration of higher density development through compatible design, and then you've got some other things there. So much of what we do and you do is context-based. And so that's the balance. It's the language about doing it contextually, compatible, and you've even got 8.4, for example, integrating medium and higher density housing types so that uses are compatible in density, scale, and aesthetics. Now, that's not that you have to match it, it just has to be compatible. And so that means not putting up a 6-story building next to a 1-story building, a 2-story building. But, so, and that's frankly what a lot of HRC is charged with doing, is judging those compatibility issues against bulk, scale, mass, and height. So I think we can still have policies calling for increased intensity, but have it be contextually compatible. Otherwise, you're going to have a lot of non-compatible development throughout the years.
If I may, I'd call it attention back to section, paragraph 1.9 about evaluating all structures over 50 years. Right now, we look around and look at structures from 1970, and it seems kind of laughable to consider them historic. But over the term of this plan, they will age 20 more years. And most buildings, even ones, venerable buildings like Old Fraser Hall, go through a period of like an awkward adolescence where they are not yet recognized as having historic value. And a big challenge is just surviving that period. So I think it strikes the right
Okay.
tone.
I'm happy. Anything else on goal 2? Goal 3? Historic buildings and structures owned by local governments and agencies. So 3.3, it has, again, it's listing community-owned buildings to the historic registers. Do we mean for all of them that pass this 50-year mark, or do we have a chance to evaluate that perhaps our post office may be more than just awkward adolescent stage?
Well, that's not a community-owned building as far as I know.
That's true, well.
So we're talking about our parks, our facility, anything city or county owned. And it's never automatic. There's always a process. There's always a discussion and analysis that goes with it.
What was the other language? Was it eligible or appropriate buildings? How about list or
evaluate community-owned buildings for historic significance or something along those lines.
yeah, I think we can't commit the community for 20 years that they have to preserve everything that was. I think many of the buildings will be and should be, but that there's evaluation. So what was the language you suggested?
Evaluate community-owned buildings for historic significance and possible listing to the historic registers or something along those lines.
Okay. Or promote appropriate buildings for listing, like that, somewhat awkward, but
We can, if you let us wordsmith
you got the
that.
intent there. Is that consensus around that? Goal number 4? Yes.
Can I ask just a
Commissioner
general
Sinclair.
question? Thank you, Chairwoman. General question about incentives, since Ms. Davy brought it up, and I think in the past, Ms. Flory and Davy have both brought this up, but incentives are used elsewhere in the plan. I mean, I think at one point, when we were talking about industrial growth, there was a section in there where it talked about incentivizing something. I think I asked what that entailed, and it was like a catalyst program that was sort of geared specifically towards industrial uses. So in my mind, having that specifically listed under industrial uses or the industrial part of the plan makes sense, and not in the part about residential development when we're talking about community benefits. Is there a reason why, like in the historic resources chapter, incentives and incentivize and that sort of language is used a handful of times, as was pointed out earlier, where it wasn't used in terms of building and I guess expanding into tier 2 and whatnot for residential development?
Yeah, a couple things. Some of this may be carryover from, the policies of Horizon 2020. I'm not sure exactly which ones, but you incentivize those things that are sort of hard to get, right? So hard to get the public either on board with, or it's a value that the community aspires to, but it's practically challenging to do so. So we know that we need to, and also incentivize means different things in different contexts. So incentivizing on an economic development context is literally using the tools of incentivization to get primary jobs here that the community wants. Incentivizing building development of some point sometimes means, what can we do for zoning entitlements that can help an outcome that we want. Same with this part of historic preservation it's that promoting and educating owners on the use of, there's not a lot of tools. Historic tax credits is one of them that we want to promote and educate people on. In fact, I believe the code establishes a fund, a city fund, for historic preservation efforts. I'm not sure it's ever been funded. So these are attempting to lay out some of those values, some of those policies that say, should the city find it valuable to fund historic preservation in a higher way, then we could build pots of money, funding, to help get private projects preserved, repaired, renovated, those sorts of things. Because there's examples of those out there right now that are maybe vacant, of high value to the owner and the community, but are struggling to activate because the repairs are steep and that kind of thing. I think the last time we talked about some of the growth and development things, we revised it to provide more of incentivized language. And so it's there, but we've had a lot of discussions about some things you might be able to do with incentives, and some things you have to do through regulation, and sometimes there's a mix of it. And so it's a broad topic because it's got a lot of different components and perspectives.
I did feel like we have talked about incentives in other chapters and other topics, but somewhat cautiously, knowing that we're asking our community to then pay for that or promote that in a financial way. And in this, it did seem like more than any other chapter, we saw that incentivize. So I don't know if it's out of balance or not, but I did notice that too.
Aren't some of these existing at federal and state level for these tax incentives already?
Yes.
And that's what's reflected in here?
Yes, there's a large amount of tax credits that float at the state and the federal level that are available, and there's also a large number of grant programs that are established for historic preservation and conservation of items. So this is really one of the elements in the comp plan that has a large outside funding pool that's even beyond the city and the county that's available to entries that want to do it. Usually those come with some triggers that you have to be on the state or the national register to be eligible for that, or you must do a certain type of rehabilitation versus just a renovation of a property. But it does have a large funding pool that's out there and available.
I mean, some of these are such, when you do the renovation, you're running into lead and asbestos, and so there are funding mechanisms out there to help offset the cost instead of just having to tear the structure down.
Right, and those are federal and state incentives to try to balance those repair costs and renovation costs against saving the building.
Commissioner Sinclair, did you have any particular wording changes or things, or particular items that you thought that incentive issue was an issue?
No, I didn't have any wording changes. I was mainly curious about the difference between requiring a community benefit as it pertains to certain residential growth and then just incentivizing preservation of historic resources. I mean, the alternative would be like, historic resources shall be preserved. I was just trying to see the difference in the process at which certain avenues of achieving results, I guess, were worded and preserved.
I would say they are different programs, they're different processes, different programs, different things to consider. The other thing is that we don't have the tax credits. The tax credits aren't a city or county function. Some of the grants are, right? But they go through the state. There are, in my opinion, they can be effective in advising and educating an owner, hey, you know, if you landmark this, you can get these tax credits, and they're 25% credit. So they're a healthy incentive for doing so. And it's a program that can work.
On 4.5, when it talks about the grants there, are those city and county grants that are being referenced? Implement facade improvement grants.
It's unrestricted, I think. I mean, it could be. I was excited. I mean, the county has really got more into the conservation and preservation game, and it's really exciting to see some of the work that they're doing with it too. I mean, typically it's been sort of a municipal thing, right? A city thing to do historic preservation. It's exciting that we're doing it in Douglas County.
Yeah, I think they have nearly every township done, and maybe they're on the last one or two. It'd be great to have that as a mid-month, to have them share those cultural resources that they've been documenting. Go ahead, Commissioner Ashworth.
Down to 4.8.
Okay.
I just retain and maintain historic single-family residences. Does that necessarily mean designated historic?
Yes, that
Okay.
second part of that is in residential, historic, and conservation
Okay, so
districts.
okay.
And districts is the formal.
I'd like to invite Commissioner Sands, if you'd like to join us. He did let us know that he would be running a little late, as he has been promoted to our newest lieutenant colonel. The 4.10 there at the bottom, it talks about maintain the Douglas County Natural and Cultural Heritage Grant Program. I just wanted to call that out, that it's been a really fabulous program and has done some great work in the county, both on the natural and cultural resources. Some of the biological surveys of natural areas have been done through that, and also what we were talking about with the township by township surveys of historical resources. So that's, just call that out. It's been really fabulous work. Any other issues on item number 4?
Yeah,
Commissioner Carter.
if I may, I'm curious, for anyone who was involved in the steering committee, several of these seem redundant to me.
Okay.
And it's not so much the number of times we state incentives.
Mhm.
It's for example, 4.4 and 4.9, I'm not sure I can tell the difference between the two except their specificity. So on one, we've got create and promote tax incentives and abatements for the restoration, renovation, and reuse of historically designated buildings and structures. And in 4.9, we've got incentivize the appropriate reuse and revitalization of historic structures. 4.2 and 4.3 both talk about tax incentives. I mean, so I just wonder if I could get a little bit of background from either from Jeff or from someone involved in the steering committee. Like, what was the process through articulating these distinct items?
So there's a couple of different factors in play here. There was an outstanding chapter for Horizon 2020 that was in the works many years before I arrived here, and it would kind of work through some of those details. So it's a little bit of bringing that proposed chapter into the existing chapter. The other side of that is there is certain requirements and things that you look for when you're going through what's called a certified local government program that they look for to be in a plan as kind of somewhere to hang their hat on, something to kind of catch that attention to it. Some of these are ways to kind of acknowledge that CLG requirement and those different levels of the items that are required is what they go through. 4.4 is really talking about, kind of uses that very similar language which you see in a CLG kind of an item there. 4.9 is a little bit of a pickup from what we saw in the revised historic resource chapter would have been in Horizon 2020 had it ever been adopted. So there is some duplication, it kind of seems like, of things in there, but they reach for different items at the end of the goal.
Mm-hmm.
So it does seem they're a little redundant at times.
Okay, yeah, as long as they each serve a distinct function, I'm happy. It just,
Okay.
if I were editing somebody else's work just for readability, I'd be like, yeah, you want to tighten this up a little.
No, that's kind of what happens when you're trying to cover all the bases legally. You get
Understood.
similar sounding things that have slightly different goals.
Yeah,
and
so I'm
meanings,
satisfied.
so.
Anything else on section A, historic resources? Okay, with that, that puts us to section B, which is parks, recreation, and open space. Again, let's just take a quick look at the sidebars. Are there any additions or changes in just that section B?
Yes.
Go ahead, Commissioner.
Under what are open spaces and the passive, or would it be possible to add trails, nature preserves, scenic overlooks, riparian and floodplain areas? So it'd be riparian and floodplain areas.
I'm not sure I heard.
Sorry, riparian and floodplain areas. I think that's all I have. Yes.
Under passive?
Uh-huh.
Would you want that duplicated from the sensitive land definition from chapter 6?
When I look at that page.
And just, there is the red line version is in the packet, so if you want to see the changes that have occurred, we were able to get those all implemented and carried over. So if you're looking for language that was done, it should be in the packet too for that one. But we had revised sensitive lands to include, I hope I can read my writing real quick, wetlands, stream corridors, and I think riparian? I'm not sure if I actually wrote riparian down there or not.
So, yes.
I'm not sure if those are types of open spaces or if those are spaces that can be, I'm not sure. Because we also have changed this definition a few times, even from the steering committee. We used to have agricultural land as one of the open spaces, and we thought that was a different discussion entirely, and took it out of this. So are those areas we should prioritize for preservation as open space, or are they open spaces in their own right and need to be in the definition?
I'm not sure. I think, I'm not sure. I don't know what other thoughts are on that, but
Why don't we hold that thought and we can come back to it as we have the discussion. Commissioner Sinclair?
Is the Lawrence Pool or like the kiddie pool, is that considered an open space? Playground, for like active playgrounds, ball fields, recreation centers, would the pool fall into that category, or is that something else?
Generally would be an active recreation.
That be a recreation center?
That's what I was wondering.
Yeah, there's obviously a line there, you know, once you get into buildings occupying the space, it's no longer open, it's literally
Right.
closed versus open, so.
I guess,
Because, sorry, go ahead.
no, finish and help.
Well, the recreation center, it seems like could include some of the inside recreation centers around town, but is that outside of the scope? Because it's not open.
Under parks recreation, but not open space, maybe. Parks and
Yeah.
recreation.
True.
Maybe I
Commissioner
can come
Payne?
back to this because there's something I want to add at the end of 2, but I find the open spaces active and passive thing kind of strange, because to me, it's like more like parks and open space, rather than, I don't know, like the active feels like parks, playgrounds, battlefields, recreation center. I guess those aren't all parks, but there's just something about that I don't know.
And
Just feels strange
cemeteries.
to me.
which are neither
And
active
cemeteries,
nor
that's
maybe more
right.
passive.
Yeah, this is a good place. That's a good point, actually.
Let's not
That's a
call them
good
parents.
place to listen to.
No, those are,
I have just a question. This isn't supposed to be an exhaustive list here. This is just examples, right? So.
Right. Yeah, and they can clearly uphold an environmental value as well, but they don't have to. It could be a large field of soccer, it could be a soccer complex we just did a CUP down south, right? They're private, they're open, you're going to get a visual aesthetic driving past it, and so, but clearly it's also very developed. as a soccer complex. So they're not, it doesn't always mean natural state. Sometimes it can mean developed as an open space.
Including trails could be concrete and developed.
Do we need this sidebar? It seems more
Well,
confusing than
I see a
clarifying.
conflict here, but I want to come back to it at the end, because I see a conflict that's not really making sense to me, but maybe I'll address that in a second.
But before we get through this, at some point, on this open space definition, we may have to hear about our open space program that is being worked out through the county, and if
Yes.
that falls under the definition that we may or may not adopt, so.
Yeah,
I'll
and that's.
let Helen
that's-
think on that, because I will call you up and ask you about it shortly. So that I thought the definition was fine in terms of just some really brief examples of what might be active or passive, so that whatever picture you have in your mind, it may be the other one also, because some people come to it from a parks perspective and some people from a natural spaces perspective, that we're talking about both. But we'll flag that. I think we'll hit that again as we go through. In terms of other sidebar definitions, we've redefined floodplain, and we have that in our current chapter 6 and in environment and natural resources. So if we could strike it from here and just have a link the first time that we mention floodplains, which might be at the end of 4.4. And steep slope, I think we also redefined that a little bit in the environment chapter under sensitive lands, I think, perhaps. And I think the only difference, I think, was 15% or greater, as opposed to strictly 15%. On advisory boards, did we have any other advisory boards besides the Parks and Recreation Advisory Board? Do we need is there a cemetery advisory board? There's a county cemetery, or individual cemetery boards.
Townships, maybe?
Yeah,
I'm not sure.
townships. All right, should we start on the vision statement? Create and maintain a variety of recreational opportunities and open spaces to increase options for residents of all ages to lead a healthy and active lifestyle. I would propose adding, maintain a variety of recreational opportunities and open spaces to protect sensitive lands and increase options for residents of all ages, blah, blah, blah. So that we have both. We're not just looking after the active part, but we're also doing this passive part of protecting sensitive lands. And some of these comments that I've penciled in on as my own are not. They came from the comments from the Kansas Biological Survey from Jennifer Delisle earlier in this process. So some of those that I will forget to give credit for were actually from that written. Does that proposed language sound okay?
Can you say that again, please?
Yes. Create and maintain a variety of recreational opportunities and open spaces to protect sensitive lands and increase options for residents of all ages to lead a healthy and active lifestyle. Does that sound okay?
I'd like to see us include ages and abilities.
Ages and abilities. Good call. That sound all right to everyone? Any other changes on the vision statement? Goal number 1. If only I could read my handwriting. 1.1 has established park and open space standards for unincorporated Douglas County. Is this where I can call up Helen, because I see you there and didn't give public comment earlier? This is something that's in the works. Is this where that would fall under, and is that enough of a placeholder for your work, or does it need to be spelled out more specifically?
Hello, Commissioners. Helen Schnoes, Sustainability and Food Systems Planner for the county. What Karen is referring to is a process the County Commission is looking to start. Last Wednesday, they adopted a project charter laying out kind of a 2-year overview for creating an open space plan, which could be thought of as a complement to like the Parks and Rec plan for the city of Lawrence. But as a planning process, we don't know quite what the specific outcomes of that would be. I'd say my understanding is that parks and open space standards as kind of used within the parks and recreation profession are more specific than I think what could come from a larger planning process. So I think a standard used in some of the other sections where there's a implementing plan, it's probably better to reference a plan itself. I'll let Scott and Jeff speak to process, because I don't want to jump ahead of them, but we've had dialogue, and I think where that very early process could lead can always be incorporated after the fact. You'll see the Food Policy Council snuck it in their comments today. So I think this could be a good place for that, but I think it would be a different statement than the standards themselves, which define a neighborhood park as being this size versus a regional park, which is this size, and kind of level of service standards for amenities based on use. And it's a more technical, as I understand it, which I'm not an expert in, and Mark Hecker should be here. But that's my kind of early assessment.
While we have you here, do you have any comment on the definition of open space, this active and passive? Is that something that works well with the work you're doing, or is it something different that you'd recommend?
I don't have a definitive answer for you. I think Commissioner Ashworth had a good point that this is not trying to be exhaustive. There was a ton of exhaustive defining in Horizon 2020, and I don't know if you could evaluate the value or use of that. The approach we took in our work about a potential open space planning process is to let a more specific community conversation narrow that definition, especially as it might relate to future programmatic recommendations. And so we have kind of just looked at what was in Horizon 2020, work of a commission about 15 years ago called Eco Squared, and how they looked at it. The agricultural land aspect is a thing where some other communities in other states have open space programs that look at agricultural land preservation too. So it's in debate.
Okay.
I would say. I think it's a good cursory gut check of what it means,
Okay.
if you're trying to be broad.
Okay.
Yeah. Is that
Thank you.
helpful? Yeah.
So do we need a different language for 1.1, or do we need to add a 1.4 saying that we would expect the plan then to look at the open space program as is proposed by the county?
I have a,
Commissioner Payton?
the thing from Jennifer Delisle, which is what I marked on here many months ago, so I'm not sure how much of this is from her and how much of it's stuff I added, but was 2.4, and I think it may make more sense under as 2.4, which was establish a Douglas County open space program to protect sensitive lands. And then I have in here especially riparian areas. I don't know if that was, or including riparian areas. I don't know if that was added by me or
I think
added
it's
by
in our
her.
sensitive land definition now, that
Okay.
we shouldn't need it additionally, so I think that's a good placeholder for it. For now, let's finish up on goal 1.1. Any other comments on that?
So if I may, the implementation section, page 107, has an item, coordinate park and open space standards between Douglas County and Lawrence. Does that cover anything of what we've been discussing here?
I think what Helen spoke to is that the standards mean something very specific. This size park is useful for these things. I think that's maybe a separate issue, that they'll coordinate their standards in addition to that the county's going to develop their own open space program. That was my understanding.
So I guess my question is this an implementation item as opposed to a plan item?
Have you asked staff? You're asking staff?
Well, so when we developed this, there was no county. There are county parks. The county had been having discussions about enhancing open space development, those sorts of things. That's how we developed the policy, right? So like some of these policies where we started 4.5, 5 years ago with, oh, we should have a cultural arts plan, and then somebody ran with it, and now there's a cultural arts plan, and so now the policy, maybe like, oh, we already have one. But we think we need policy support to continue the efforts of establishing a park and open space. Maybe it's program instead of standards, right? I mean, what we're looking for is the county to enhance its existing parks programs to go further and work on open space programming. And then we've got policy language that says, oh, and by the way, the city and county should coordinate when appropriate and feasible on parks. So that's kind of the background behind the policy statements.
So I think the 1.3, which says they're going to coordinate between the city and the county, coordinate their standards, park standards, I think can stand. And then maybe 1.1 should change to Commissioner Payton's language, which was suggested for 2.4, which is just establish a Douglas County open space program. Does that sound all right? Anything else on goal number 1?
So if you repeat what 1.1 should say?
Establish a Douglas County open space program.
Scott, do you think there's?
Would you like to, establish an open space program for the unincorporated areas of Douglas County, as amended by Helen Schnoes.
Wait, so we're keeping unincorporated?
That
Did
is
you
the-
say?
That is the intent, is that the program would count
Would
outside of
be
the city
outside of-
limits of all the cities of Douglas County. That's the program that's being worked on.
So, all right, let me think on that for a second.
Okay. Goal 2. On the verbiage at the beginning, protect key aspects of our community, are we talking about people or resources? We're talking about populations or natural resources?
I think there we're talking about the physical, maybe the sensitive lands and the physical environmental features.
Okay. On 2.1, when it talks about land dedications, does that mean that, land that's given to the city as opposed to like a conservation easement, which is where ownership is maintained by a private entity, but it then, some of the development potential is
It could be as open as the tools allow.
okay. Because conservation easements we've talked about specifically, and I think if we're talking about both, because because people do give land to the city for parks or purposes like that, which is different from a conservation easement. I guess we do have other voluntary mechanisms, but perhaps we should have both in there. Incentivize land dedications, conservation easements, and other voluntary mechanisms to protect natural and historic areas. And do we always want those land dedications?
No. We don't always accept them, I would say.
So we certainly can't always incentivize them if we didn't want them all in the first place.
Well, true, but, again, 40,000 foot level, we want to incentivize for the goal above to protect key aspects of the community.
Okay.
Non-key aspects of the community can fend for themselves.
Also implied. Anything else on goal number 2?
I have just a couple questions.
Commissioner Sands.
When we say incentivize land dedications, what potential, what are the potential policy items on the menu that we could use to incentivize it?
Well, it could be in our code, for example, as it relates to sensitive lands, we have certain bonuses for density, height maybe, if there are greater conservation of sensitive lands. as an example. Now, those aren't always dedicated, sometimes
Right.
those are held privately in a tract.
So they have to be near the, in physical locality too? Because you said sensitive lands, and what we have here is natural and historic areas of community on 2.1 and key natural and historic areas in 2.2. Are we talking about our defined sensitive lands, or are we?
Not necessarily, I was
Okay.
just, that was a point of what
Okay.
what the code speaks to right now. To be honest, we probably get more discussions about will the city accept a dedication of floodway and floodplain?
Mhm.
Hard to maintain lands, for
Mhm.
example, undevelopable lands.
Mhm.
Lands that are sensitive for a lot of environmental reasons, but aren't developable. Sometimes the city will accept that and help turn those into nice trail system, parks, open space, whatever.
Is there any value in making the terms in 2.1 and 2.2 more similar, where we talk, in 2.1 it's protect natural and historic areas of the community. In 2.2, it adds emphasis, especially key natural and historic areas. I understand that natural and historic areas are both the four common words there, but one seems more emphasized than the other. And then the word key, maybe could be appropriate to insert into 2.1 as well. And I wanted to ask, when we talk key natural areas, because I'm outside of my wheelhouse when we talk about riparian areas and grade and soil, what defines key? Because if it's sensitive lands, then I think we should specify that, but if it's another defined area, I think that's useful too. Key historic areas, I think we could probably all agree to, or historic sites,
Well,
but
I
key
would,
natural area?
I'm not sure there was a real effort to make that kind of distinction that you're agreeing with. It's either gonna be natural and historic or it's not. I don't know that we have a
Okay.
key historic area.
Okay.
So I would recommend just maybe striking that word.
Strike the word key and make them more equal statements. Does that
'Cause
sound
you're right, we
Caroline?
haven't assessed every natural and historic area and said, these are key and these aren't.
Well, and I'm not suggesting we do that, I'm just saying,
No, I know,
maybe
but to your
bring that
point, I'm
yeah.
agreeing with the point.
to.
Sound all right? To strike the word key and make those two more parallel.
Mhm.
Commissioner Ashworth had commented one of our other discussions about prioritizing wild spaces with our parks. And I've flagged it in a couple of places and haven't decided, at the end of like 3 different sections. I can't really decide where that might be most appropriate to be cited. It could possibly be here as a 2.4, that we prioritize wild spaces and not just, manicured parks, but there might be a better place for it. I just haven't figured out what that might be. So perhaps we'll just keep an eye out for that as we
Well,
look through.
So I would say, I think it's useful to maybe include that as a whole statement somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
As a park user, I think my family gets far more enjoyment out of the parks in the wild spaces than the cut grass.
And perhaps under goal number 3, which talks about quality of life, that might be a good place for it rather than in goal 2. Do we have any other comments specific to goal 2 before we move forward?
Only that
Commissioner
might
Strickland?
be appropriate in goal 5, but we can get to that.
Okay. We'll just put it everywhere. Goal 3. I struck, instead of parkland and open space, I tried to echo the language we'd used in the definition and say creating active and passive open space areas, and just kind of have some continuity. Have any comments on that?
They may be doing two different things there, though, because parkland can include highly developed buildings,
Okay,
I think is where we were.
okay, that's fine. We'll leave it as is. Is that okay? On the bold, number 3, identify and expand existing park recreation open space systems. It seems like in Lawrence, we may be able to expand existing park recreation and open space, but we're also creating new in Douglas County. And I was trying to, creating new spaces and systems. Can we reflect both what's going on in the city and the county in the same statement somehow?
As far as new
The,
park.
the
new open
identify
space
seems odd.
Well, going back to the beginning of goal 2, that they addressed that a little bit there. As far as new spaces.
Yeah, that's new spaces, so, would it just be, well, it's not expand only, maybe we just leave it like it is. Let's see if anybody has another comment.
I see what you mean. You think this is just talking about existing in this case, you're in the bolded goal 3?
Yeah, 3.4 does talk about new open spaces, so
Just
maybe
say
we do.
Identify new, And-
3.3 says new.
yeah.
So I guess we do need to have both. Identify new and expand existing park recreation open space systems. Systems is weird. Open spaces. Identify new and expand existing park recreation and open spaces. Is that not any better?
We think of it as the park system, probably is how we got the
Okay.
terminology.
Maybe
Systems.
substitute network for system, park network. Or,
They say they like systems.
More connectivity is suggested by that. I don't know.
Yeah, I
Commis-
see that as more, saying more connectivity or, parks that function as, I don't know if you think of the
The
loop.
commission likes networks. How do you feel about that?
Or system.
Then a
Leave as
matrix.
is.
Just create a matrix.
Commissioner
I like
Stockwell.
systems because it talks not only about the connectivity of them, but their functionality as well.
Okay.
And I know that Mark Hecker has long talked about our ring of parks, a green ring around the city. And this is not just things that are connected by a trail or by a green passageway, but that they function as a system and that they contribute to a whole in that way.
Complementary
Exactly, exactly. And so, and roads are in networks, I guess they're systems also, but I like the word systems here because I think it talks about the function of parks.
So we're at identify new and expand existing park recreation and open space systems. Is that still okay with everybody?
Yeah.
Enough to pass it on? On 3.4, we have locate park recreation and open space locations, which is locating locations is odd, near other community facilities such as schools and such. And sometimes I think it can happen the other way around, where a school may locate near a particular natural area that we want to preserve. So I'd like to change it to co-locate park recreation and open spaces or
Sites,
system, I'm gonna take out locations,
areas.
with other community facilities. So, co-locate with other community facilities.
Now that you've said locations 4 times, can you strike locations?
Yes, I struck it already.
The second location.
Uh-huh.
It seems like thesaurus night.
Since on 3.2, we have locate locations also, I actually struck the first locate and said plan and develop park recreation and open space locations, consistent, because, I couldn't take it. But I didn't think it was important enough to mention until you did.
My OCD approves.
Any other comments on goal 3? Is this where we put our wild spaces, or do we put it someplace else?
I'm thinking more towards the 5.
Goal number 4.
I had one suggestion
Mm-hmm.
in 4.2. Just capitalize on street and utility improvement projects as opportunities to include sidewalks, bikeways, and trails.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to add, as an opportunity to include sidewalks, bikeways, green infrastructure, and trails, if that's appropriate in that section. But then that prompts a question as to what the city defines as green infrastructure. I mean, I have in my mind, when I think of green infrastructure, stormwater spaces. But then green infrastructure might also mean the park network to the city, so I didn't know how that might be interpreted or used
Well,
in that section.
I think in the context of this chapter,
Mhm.
this division, this goal, it's about actively engaging a park program, right?
Mhm.
So bikeways, sidewalks, rec trails for the
Okay.
use of people.
Mhm.
And I think we, if I recall, did some green infrastructure work back in
We
chapter
did,
6.
yes. I guess I sort of think of green infrastructure sometimes as an opportunity to add
Sure.
green space in an urban area.
Yeah, this
That
is
would be-
really a nod to trying to activate a right-of-way for all users
Okay.
as a complete streets model, from the perspective of activeness and activity from a park program. But they are connected clearly throughout the whole document.
Are you comfortable with the current
Yeah.
language? Okay. 4.1, I have create connections throughout our communities as opposed to the community, kind of acknowledging that we have many communities within Lawrence and Douglas County.
Can I actually
Mhm.
go back? Capitalize on street and utility improvement projects as opportunities to include sidewalks, bikeways, and trails. So for instance, say 19th and Iowa, the tunnel that's happening now would be something like that.
Yes,
Okay.
I think so. And that was a very specific
Right,
project.
but I'm just
But,
kind of, it falls under there is what I'm asking.
yeah, the K-10 project even, as we provided
Mhm.
input at the state level to make sure that the trail system was developed with that whole highway system.
4.4 has the first use of the word floodplains in this chapter, just to link that back to our definition in the other chapter. And I also suggested some language, connect lands providing continuity for floodplains, watercourses, or floodplains and watercourses as wildlife corridors. Just propose that language, it changes it a little. Guess they need to exist for themselves as well as for wildlife corridors, but. So just leave it as is, and continuity for floodplains, watercourses, and wildlife corridors? Just leave the and? Is that okay?
I like adding corridor somewhere in there. That's
Okay.
good.
So the only addition then would be the word corridors at the end. Anything on goal 4? Goal 5? I would suggest, instead of preserve and enhance, because you can't really enhance natural areas, I would preserve and restore natural areas of the community.
I would argue you could enhance some natural areas with
Okay.
restoration activities.
Alrighty.
When you have garlic mustard and
Uh-huh.
various invasive species coming in, you
Mhm.
can enhance.
Is enhance the word you'd want there? You okay with
That
it?
covers it, yeah.
Okay.
Mhm.
Enhance and restore.
No, I'm happy to leave it. Julie is happy to leave it. Commissioner Butler. In 5.1, sensitive land, that's the first time that that definition, I think, is used. If we can have a link back to the definition in previous chapter. And I have protection instead of retention, promote sensitive land protection through conservation easements and other voluntary programs.
Trigger word.
Hmm?
It's a trigger word.
The retention or the protection?
Retention is, I mean, when you say protection, it's gonna, that word triggers certain reactions among certain parts. We're gonna, but retaining them.
You think
is
sounds
pretty much the
safer?
same thing, but,
Mhm. Promote sensitive land retention through conservation easements and other voluntary programs.
mhm.
Kind of, I mean, to me, protection has a little broader impact, because it's not just the actual parcel. If you're going to protect the actual parcel, there are things that might happen on the outskirts of
Mhm.
that particular parcel that would protect it,
Commissioner
not
Carpenter,
just
what do you
retain,
think?
Yep.
retain it.
Sounds good.
Go with protect or retention? Protection or retention? Any other inputs?
So if I may, the point here is to use a tool outside of the regulatory tool, right? So promoted through conservation easements,
Mm-hmm.
whereas protection of sensitive lands means something more sort of regulatory in our minds, in our language.
Mm-hmm.
There, see.
So I think retention outside of what the regulations may require
Mm-hmm.
is the goal of this particular policy. Because we don't control conservation easements, you know, we control other rules about development. But the point of this one was to, you know, work with our partners who have other methods and means of educating owners on conservation easements and their use and promoting them and advocating for them, I think was the point of this thing.
So we should stick with retention as the more to the point of what was being, I'm okay with that. Okay with that?
Was there more to that, though, if we keep retention?
Through programs such as conservation easements. I just echoed the language that had been in other places. It really doesn't change the meaning of it, either is fine. 5.2, we have incorporate natural elements. Can we just say sensitive lands? Because that, we have a definition for that. Natural
Sensitive lands
elements.
has a particular definition, correct?
Mhm.
Correct,
Mhm.
that would
Under our
be,
code.
right.
And what you're doing here is we're trying to keep natural features of the landscape, which may not necessarily rise to the level of the definition of sensitive lands.
Correct.
Okay.
Okay.
So
So we
this
should-
is,
Leave it as is.
I think so. Because this can be one of those negotiating tools in Tier 2 annexation right there.
Would this be a place to put in the wild space, prioritizing wild space at the end, like as a 5.4?
Mhm.
I think it probably falls there best. We recommend a 5.4, prioritizing the use of some wild spaces in our open space planning. So, Commissioner Ashworth, would you recommend any other language with that? Okay. Gotten through this
Can you-
section and have not,
Can you say
yes.
that last one more time? What's the language?
Prioritize some inclusion of wild spaces in, what did I say?
In the open space planning, is that what you
Something
said,
like
open
that.
space planning?
It
Program.
says space
Program.
twice.
I
Yeah,
have,
that's-
providing, prioritizing sub-inclusion of wild spaces in open space planning.
Yeah. Is that not super strong, but
Is it
Commissioner
appropriate
says,
to put a wild space definition in the sidebar? I'm not trying to turn it into a whole thing, but.
right, I guess I'd leave it open, it's just, I would, but
I guess,
Commissioner Struckoff.
could you say, as we were just discussing, in the open space program, or instead of open space planning, that's a little more definite and a little more concrete about where it would go. And we make it a component of the program, I mean, it would kind of call for that as to be part of the program, instead of just the general idea that we're gonna plan for these things, just an idea.
There's a third alternative. We've used the term, park, recreation, and open space systems.
Yeah, I would do
It's
that.
everything, right? I mean, you're talking about
Yeah.
trying to incorporate it in all that we do.
Like neighborhood parks, I mean, a place that is wild that kids can get to, I think is of value. So I would go with that. Parks, because it's extra wordy. Parks, recreation, and open space systems. And we haven't talked about cemeteries, and I think we probably should. Ms. Shipley, would you care to step to the microphone and tell us where you think cemeteries could possibly go in this document?
Thank you, I'm sorry. I was looking at the facilities section, which is the next section you guys are gonna talk about. I guess in as much as cemeteries are not indoors, it's not a facility, but in as much as it is something that people use, it's constantly being added to. And people are always there. I mean, obviously with lawn maintenance being the greatest thing that happens in the cemeteries, it's constantly active. That was the only kind of appropriate, but I don't even know how you would specify that. It's, a cemetery, like Oak Hill, especially a historical cemetery, was created specifically to be a park. People were supposed to go there and have picnics and go there. And on the other side of the road where Memorial Cemetery is, not at all. It's supposed to be lined and straight and flat, and nobody's supposed to go there. So it's just a hybrid kind of place. So I don't know how you would want to address that, but I just didn't want people to forget about the
Right.
fact that we are responsible for it, and we do need to make it sustainable.
I guess I would recommend, rather than try and craft something from here, maybe we would task staff with, as we have our cleanup day for Wednesday, and I actually would maybe recommend putting it back in the Parks, Recreation, and Open Space, but maybe because we did go to the cemetery for parks when I was a kid and feed the ducks, and maybe that's odd, but that's what we did.
It's more active open space.
It is.
You just can't play soccer.
I learned to drive in the cemetery. Is that odd too?
Well, I will say there is such a thing as cemetery, there is cemetery tourism now, and I know it may seem strange to a lot of people, but it is a very historic cemetery that we have, so you do want to, just like in historic resources, you want to encourage people.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great comment. Parks and Rec maintains them. I don't know if they consider it a park and rec, activity, but perhaps we can talk this over with the director and see where maybe he would like to see it in our plan as well, and bring that back to you.
Okay, I would like that.
Thank you.
Thanks for bringing it forward. Are there any other comments or anything that we missed in this section, Section B, Parks, Recreation, and Open Space? Our definition. Is that what you were, sorry, Commissioner Payton?
So what did you just say?
Did you want to go back to the definition of open spaces? You started with that.
No, I think I'm okay with that.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm okay with that. You'll have to excuse me because you actually covered 5.1 and 5.2 as I had been looking for something from the Grassland Heritage Foundation and couldn't find it and realized that Commissioner Sinclair had it up. And so I said, wait. So while you were covering that, I was looking at the notes that I got from them, and so I didn't know if that had come up as on anything, which was...
I took those into consideration. I have them up here with it and felt that because we have such a strong definition of sensitive lands, that already echoed back to it pretty well.
Okay.
So I was comfortable with it. I would recommend we take a short recess before we start on Section C. Let's give us 5 minutes and then come back. right, we will reconvene. And as often happens at this time of night on a rainy Monday, we have exhausted our audience down to one who has asked that we move her section up instead of having to sit through community facilities and arts and culture. So I would concur that we could handle the food systems development, which would be section E, next. So if anyone has any comments on the sidebars or definitions. I want to scroll back to the comments, which we have on behalf of the Food Policy Council. Does anyone have any comments on the vision statement? There is only one goal, so how about goal number 1? I'm trying to digest these comments at the same time. I'm having
Madam Chair.
trouble getting it on the fly. Yes, Commissioner Sands.
So, in a lot of these, we incentivize. In this one, we are identifying and encouraging. And I'll ask a similar question what I've asked in the past. When it comes to encourage, what are the specific, what's on the menu of specific policy examples that would encourage opportunity?
Is that a question for staff?
I'm sorry, yes, it is.
Good.
Well, we leaned heavily, I think, on food policy. Maybe Helen can give us some ideas about that. But, I mean, in terms of the language, usually incentivizing means there's gonna be a future discussion about a government incentive offered
Right,
to gain something.
right.
Encouraging.
Usually economic.
Usually
Yeah.
it's economic, or, yeah, usually it's economic. Encouraging may have other components, like education or advocacy, those kinds of things associated with it.
I think we may need to have, if it's possible, to put up the comments from the Food Policy Council, because where we have one goal in our document, they have 4 suggested goals in theirs. That's why we're having trouble comparing these apples to oranges. Is it possible to get that on the screen?
I'm also
Yeah,
wondering,
to know,
since
we can
we're
find
talking
the page
about
number.
basically incorporating the food systems plan,
We'll find the page number.
and we have a person here, maybe
368 in our packet.
Maybe Helen, why don't you just come up here so you can be part of the conversation about your plan that we're talking about?
I think we're struggling a little bit with that, since we incorporate the entire plan by reference, how much of it do we need to have in the chapter?
Right, I think that's a really good point. So you'll see the Food Policy Council took the approach of kind of suggesting a rewrite to this
I
section.
see that. Which came in at 1 o'clock today, by the way.
Which was delivered on Friday. So there's several motivations for this, and I'm sorry that the chair, Kim Kreiner, had to leave, so I'm speaking in her honor. You could say, I think some inspiration came from the structure of the arts and culture section, which I know I just asked you to skip, where I think, I mean, the council's been engaged in this process for 5 years in multiple rounds of edits. I think some of the language that's under the current goal 1 may not relate to the goal statement. Plan for equitable, healthy, and local food access throughout the county in 1.7, current 1.7. I don't know if that's actually about identifying and encouraging opportunities for growth in local agriculture, employment, tax base, and income. So I think we were trying to look at what are the aspects of land use and food systems development across the food system plan, and how can we speak to those more concrete goals at a very high level, and a level that relates to development or land use, but shows the breadth of food systems development. And that's where the themes of wealth, health, and resilience came out. So the idea is that the first goal is plan in accordance with the food systems plan. As you said, that entails a lot of other things, but for those most important aspects in terms of development, about ensuring the role of agriculture, working for equitable and healthy food access, and thinking about the resilience of our agricultural and food landscapes, we thought there could be value in having that reflected in a high-level document like the comprehensive plan. And like I said, I think it has some parity to some of the other chapters, or some of the other sections in this chapter of community resources, and balancing the broad and specific. So they're all here for your consideration. And
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can see as we're looking through the sub-goals under number 1, that though goal number 1 does talk about income and financial development, only points 1.4, 1.5, and 1.6 really speak specifically to finances. And 1.4 really is only about funding for conservation easements, which could land on something else. Expansion of farmers markets is economic. 1.6, economic development support for the regional food system. Those are all economic. So I do think we need at least another goal that kind of incorporates some of these other points about equitable and healthy local food access and so on. It is a lot to digest, so.
our
Keep
meeting
saying
was
that,
Monday.
sorry. It's a lot to talk through.
If I might, a couple things that jump out at me that I'm not, in just my initial looking at this, that aren't incorporated into the food system development in the current plan, is the resilient future for our food system, that
Where are
particularly
you?
mentions climate change,
Where are you?
on their notes.
Uh-huh.
So it's, which, where is it? 4.
Okay.
Their point 4. I think that would be a valuable addition and to have some language reflecting that in the plan.
So would you take as a goal something like this, ensure a resilient future, and then these subpoints?
Yes, resilient future for our food system as it relates to being impacted by climate change. I'm looking to see if the language, because we already have some of that.
1.2 and 1.3, I think, would fall under a goal like that of our current.
Oh, the current.
And then additional language about a climate change plan. What if we had, I'm looking at the language above goal 4 in their recommended language. So we have our local food system depends on the integrity of our agricultural landscapes, including healthy soils, clean water, and biodiversity, all which will be impacted by climate change. And incorporating under that our current 1.2 and 1.3, which are conservation and protection of high-quality soils in our specific land use plans, and an agricultural preservation plan for working lands, and then what other sub-goals of theirs? What's the name of our climate plan? Do we have a currently adopted climate mitigation plan? Is that the name of it?
I think there's, what do you all call your current?
So we don't have like so in 2009, the city adopted a climate protection plan. It's more a series of recommendations rather than a more specific land use plan or action plan. And so I believe that is already incorporated by reference, correct, Jeff? It's in the
Yes.
back.
This
Um,
plan seeks to build a true climate protection.
In chapter 6, I believe there's language about a climate adaptation
There we go,
plan.
that's the name.
The language reflected here is the result of, language from one of our members who wanted to acknowledge the current climate protection plan, the need for updating it, which is something the Sustainability Office is, trying to kind of garner resources and momentum for in light of some recent, discussions with the City Commission. So I think that language could be played with as long as it's consistent throughout the plan. I think generally it's trying to echo the climate adaptation planning that, is spoken for elsewhere in the comprehensive plan.
Yeah, I want to make sure we call it the same thing. And so climate adaptation plan is what's referred to in environment chapter.
The task force report is on page 91 of the comprehensive plan as a reference plan, but it's just a task force report. It is not a.
Okay, it's not a plan.
In essence.
And then I believe in chapter 6 of Plan 2040, there's language about a climate adaptation. So we don't have it yet, so there's not specific language about it
Right.
yet, which I think is part of the need for something new, but the tension in what's reflected in this document.
Currently, the plan is referenced as 6.1 on page 60, and it's in the natural resources section.
Okay. Under the name climate adaptation plan.
Yes.
Okay.
Some of the tension in the climate change work is we know we can't just protect ourselves because climate is changing, so we need to adapt, but we don't want to just say everything's lost, let's just get ready for really hot, summers. So in the field has evolved since the climate protection plan was created about 10 years ago, and I think there's just a need to kind of honor that and the need to
Right.
adapt as well.
Kind of give you some background about the existence of this part of 7 here. This was issue number 14 in the issue action report that was entitled Encourage and Support Local Food System Development. So it was derived right out of the issue action report based on the steering committee's guidance. They found at the time that the existing strength in Horizon 2020 was low and provided 3 action steps within that. That's what was the structure of this chapter, or component of a chapter, excuse me. So.
So would that be in addition, back to the, trying to incorporate that language into the food system development, a separate point that would be titled Ensure a Resilient Future for Our Food System by ensuring the integrity of our agricultural landscapes, including healthy soils, clean water, something like that?
Yeah, I don't have a problem with the language leading up to that goal 4, and the point saying ensure a resilient future for our food system. I think we can reference a future climate plan there, and then pull in our 1.2 and 1.3. Not sure what number goal that's going to be yet. We also need a goal heading that talks about this from an economic standpoint, and perhaps what we have can stand as goal number 1 or whatever goal number it is, and have 1.4, 1.5, and 1.6 under it. I would actually probably move 1.4 to the point the goal we just talked about instead.
And so your new goal would start how again?
This language, our local food system depends on the integrity of our agricultural landscapes.
No, I was thinking about the new one you were saying about the
sorry.
economic. I didn't see where you were.
Sorry, I was looking at our very own goal number 1.
Oh, okay.
So identify and encourage opportunities for growth in local agricultural employment, tax base, and income.
Okay,
Would have at least 1.5 and 1.6.
I see, okay.
though it needs to call out something about the rest of our agricultural sector, because we have farmers markets, we have in 1.5. In 1.6, we have value-added agriculture, but we also need to support the largest economic sector of our county, which is larger scale agriculture. So we need to have a point that talks about that too. Go ahead.
Their revision had goal 1 as kind of overall food systems work, implement the food system plan, and then they kind of to have more goals and policy statements be thematic and kind of more tightly bound. Most of those economic components are in their drafted goal 2, and they took the approach of actually removing specific reference to farmers markets, and instead speaking to economic development and other supports for a kind of broader food and ag businesses. So just to call that to your attention as you talk about.
Okay, so
options.
the 2.2 on the suggested language is develop support for economic development and business support services tailored to a diversified regional food system, including infrastructure and value-added agricultural production. I would say under the diversified agricultural systems, including, because that value-added does play into the regional food system. There's a great deal of agriculture that happens here that is not accounted for in the document, in either document.
What types
Most of our acreage,
is in what?
commodity agriculture.
Commodity agriculture, okay.
So rather than the farmers markets,
Isn't that part of a diversified regional food system? That would be incorporated in, to include commodity agriculture?
I would say diversified agricultural systems. There's also fiber, there's also, other kinds of agricultural commodities that are not necessarily eaten. By that I mean wool and not like
But
the
we
kind
are
of
talking
fiber
about
where we get our
food
internet.
in this one, right?
It is food systems development, but we're talking about agriculture's role in our community. We can't ignore in the entirety of those acres and the people who do the work. All right, I'm open to suggestions. Somebody else take it for a while.
Well, I do have one question about the food policy, food systems plan, which was given to us at a mid-month. Under the economic development on page 9 of that plan, it talks about value-added agriculture, regional food system infrastructure such as processing facilities as targeted industries to support. And it says, in fact, Douglas County currently has no commercial animal processing facilities. What was the discussion around that, and what scale of animal processing, if any, was discussed?
You're welcome to put that back on me if you feel that's appropriate.
Commissioner Willie.
So, local butchers, we don't have any in Douglas County. We have to go to surrounding counties. So if we want to encourage small landholders to be producing their own food for themselves and their neighbors,
You know where I'm going with this.
you don't want the
CAFOs
yeah.
and
But there's a
Garden City type animal processing facility in rural Douglas County. I don't.
so the local arbiter is usually the term that's used, but it's not widely known. But yes, small scale animal processing, which is a need in our community, and the neighboring counties that have them are booked 9 months out. That's a real bottleneck in production. So
Is that do we need to mention scale of facilities?
I'll see if Scott or Jeff have something to add. I'd say that this is more like that high-level comp plan language, and it would be our county zoning regulations and, those more implementing devices that would set those sorts of standards.
Jeff looks like he wants to talk.
I would just remind the planning commission that agriculture and farming is one of those highly protected items under state law, so even a great many things that we'd want to say in the county zoning code we couldn't do because it is so protected at the highest level. So keep that in mind as we talk
But
about regulations.
This is one area where the county did take a stand when there was a facility proposed by Tonganoxie. The county took a very definite stand about that, so there's gonna be some tension between the county and the higher levels.
So we have, we need some goal that talks about the economics, and we need a goal that talks about the future of our system, so what things need to be preserved in order to have a future food system. What are some of these other points that are in here? It's this number 3. This is the equitable, healthy, and local food access. And I just really don't want to get into the point of reiterating everything that's in the food systems plan in here. I think we need to shorten considerably the language that's been given to us and work it into something that works in the balance of the rest of the plan here. So I would very much like some help and input from the rest of the commission in making that happen.
So we're gonna go and start at the beginning of their proposed document and work through it like that, or how do you suggest we do that?
I don't know. I guess so. I think we can accept the goal as we, or as our vision statement. Let's just look at our vision statement. We have communities, health, and resilience. Was there another word that was suggested in here?
Health, wealth, and resilience is what
Health,
they said.
wealth. I think that's acceptable. People agree with that. Let's do. I'm gonna kind of pass through what they have as goal number 1. I think some of that, we will have to reference the Douglas County Food System Plan under one of these other points. Goal number 2 is the economics, where we have our,
Not much difference there.
there's a, yeah.
That covers it.
So you like the language that they have in goal number 2, which would be then goal number 1? Develop support.
It's almost identical, so.
Yeah,
except
I'd go
for
with
food-based
diversified
enterprises.
agricultural systems, and the rest can stay as it is. And it has the working lands. I think that their 2.1, maintain and protect working lands and high-quality soils, I think that that needs to actually go under that, protecting the future of that, what they have as number 4, the resilient future for food systems. I would put that under there. Are you following this, Jeff? I hope better than I am.
I'm struggling.
Yeah,
Okay,
I don't think we're getting,
okay.
Do we have a printout of this by chance?
Did you bring them for everybody?
I brought 3 and 2 of them walked away.
And I don't know, Madam Chair, if it's helpful for you to write remarks on this and
Uh-huh.
give it to us later, or we'll try
Possibly.
to follow.
I would take that.
Either
So you
way,
only- Okay.
I just thought it might help to be able to chicken
Right.
scratch on something.
If only you could read my handwriting. Thank you very much. Okay, so our vision was the same. We have wealth, health, and resilience. I was striking goal number 1 and going to goal number 2, ensuring agriculture's role in our community helps signify its importance in the local economy and shapes our identity. Identify and encourage, okay, that's the same as our goal number 1, so we'll retain that. 2.1, maintain and protect working lands and high-quality agricultural soils for future generations, including as part of specific land use plans, which was one of our original points. I'd like to, we'll save that and put it under what in their language is goal 4. 2.2. Diversified agricultural system, including infrastructure and value-added agricultural production, or, yeah. And what else do we have?
Chairwoman, if I could just,
Yes.
so when you said, you said add ensuring agriculture's role in our community, but that didn't have a number attached to it. So was
There's
that gonna
goal-
be 2?
That will, it's listed as 2 on there, it'll become goal
it's-
number 1.
That statement, ensuring agriculture's role in our community, would have 2 before it?
Ensuring
The
agriculture.
number 2?
There's always a little blurb, and then there's the number,
Okay.
and then, so that's just the format we've
Okay.
been using. So that's the lead up into goal number 2.
Goal number, okay.
And everybody just chime in as you like it.
Madam Chairwoman?
Yes.
Were you recommending that 2.1 be added?
2.1, I would like to put under what is currently listed as goal 4 for now, so hold
Uh-huh.
off on that one.
Okay, because
Because
I was,
that's more under the future, resilient future.
I'm trying to identify, I thought we had something in natural resources chapter
On,
on high quality. It's 2.7, in protect high quality agricultural soils as defined in each specific land use plan as the community develops to urban densities. Okay, so maybe there is
I think it's worth
a
having
difference there.
with
Well,
food
yeah, because
systems
this one's
as
for
well.
urban densities and, yeah, okay.
Okay, so what in our plan was 1.6 is included here as 2.2. And that language is fairly similar. So moving to point number 3, equitable, healthy, and local food access, celebrates cultural diversity. Enhance the built environment connectivity to promote healthy food access through the planning process. Does anybody have any comments on that? Yes, please.
I don't know what how the discussion worked with the idea of reduced food miles. I mean, there's a positive and definite desire to support local growers and to keep dollars local and spend them with our community partners. Was there discussion about, this also means that either the goal or just a side effect is to reduce the amount of miles that food travels to get to our table, that sort of thing. This is, the food miles concept is something that has been used in the past. It's not really addressed in either the food system plan or this, and I don't know that it's absolutely necessary, because we are talking about local. We say local over and over again, and I think that carries that, but I don't know whether it's necessary to address if we are trying to avoid food miles. Is that something that was discussed?
Yeah, so this section actually previously, I think in the 2017 version, was called local foods. And it was a recommendation of the Food Policy Council to speak to food systems development, because some of the access and now the considerations of climate change are a bit broader than that. I think the language from the issue action report also speaks to food deserts and ecology and kind of those broader things. The definition of even food systems development as it's revised, I believe, talks about keeping dollars within your community. And more specifically in the food system plan, particularly beyond land use considerations, there are a lot of goals about supporting local purchasing. So I'd say that's some of the more specific goals of parts of the food system plan, whereas the food systems development hits on these other aspects that might not look to that specific goal, but it's a part of it.
Because that's certainly part of the climate and the sustainability.
Yeah.
So, thanks.
Okay, any other comments on what's listed there is their goal 3, which is the strong local food system includes equitable, healthy, and local food access through Douglas County that celebrates our cultural diversity. And we have several points under that that I think are a pretty good fit. Give everybody a chance to read them. What is an agriculture-based cluster subdivision?
It is something you've seen and that's been coming up in other communities that they've either had to work into their comprehensive plan or have incorporated into some updated comprehensive plan. So think of it as just as a housing development that might be built on a golf course. Folks are looking to build a working farm into a cluster subdivision. So those are set up in different ways with a land trust partner or a nonprofit partner that oversees it. And what that agriculture looks like, I've seen different models for, but that's the kind of idea. And so that is in the food systems plan, and we thought that given the land use connection, it might be interesting to call out. I heard word that there might be some developers in Douglas County looking at that, so just kind of a suggestion to perhaps get ahead of that potential proposal.
Okay. So in striking goal 1, I'm still looking for a place to put, and then just have the 3 goals, which would be economics, equity, and future, resilient future. Looking for a place then to put this, that we should look to implement the recommendations of the food system plan that's incorporated by reference. Can that fit under one of those goals, or does it need to have a standalone place? Because we can resurrect goal number 1 there to fill that same place.
We
Helen?
followed the model of the arts and culture chapter where the first goal is
To implement that.
yeah, that's how we struggled through that one.
Uh-huh.
I know that makes it 4 instead of 3.
No, I think that's fine. Is plan in accordance and implement? I mean, we've kind of said that governing bodies can't be held specifically just to the work of a community board for their policy. So I can't remember what language we used when we came across that before, but it was with affordable housing that we can't just accept or adopt or implement, but we need to consider. Maybe that was the word we used.
That was it.
Is it
They may have. And we've also been trying with these sort of plans that are not fully in the development realm. We've talked about, like in the cultural arts plan, talked about implementing the goals in the development process so that just everybody knows the roles that you have before you.
So what's the language you would suggest? Is it consider the recommendations of the Douglas County Food System Plan?
Yeah, for affordable housing, you said consider the goals and policies of the advisory board when creating land use plans and reviewing development applications.
Okay, let's
I
echo
really
that
like
language, yeah.
language. That was 6.1.
Okay, so I think we will use the goal 1 with the language that we have there for 1.1. Then we have strengthen collaboration among public, private, and community partners to ensure robust food system. I think that can probably stay as it is. People happy with that? Okay, I think we mostly have, I think we've incorporated everything that we had in the original chapter subsection E back into this framework with 4 goals.
I think there might be some value in adding the definition of a local food system.
Mm-hmm.
Most people kind of get the local food idea, but the local
Uh-huh.
food system is,
That's the
you know,
recommended sidebar at the bottom.
yeah, the sidebar at the bottom.
Would you strike the sidebar, what are local foods,
No.
and instead have, what is a local food system? Because that might be more relevant and might cover.
I just think we should have the definition of local food system.
Uh-huh.
In addition, I mean, we can keep the local foods if you want, but
Mhm.
the local food system.
Well,
I
the
think we would
existing
cover
chapter on
it.
local foods could be the introductory chapter to, or introductory paragraph to a local food system. Is it inclusive?
Mhm.
I mean, in order to understand a local food system, don't you start by understanding what a local
Uh-huh.
food?
I think we could cover it all under one definition, would be my, which we'll let you write. So yeah, we'd like a sidebar that's
Mhm.
for what is a local food system, that might use some of the language from what are local foods, but not have a separate placeholder for that. Okay. What I'd like especially is that on Wednesday, when we come back, that we look at the red line version of this and look at, this is considerably more rewrite than we were anticipating for this section. So I would like everybody to have eyes on it, looking at the same thing, and we won't spend a lot of time on it, but I would like us to flag that. Are we allowed to do that within the way we've advertised how our agenda will go?
Yes.
May
Okay.
not
On-
have a red line by Wednesday.
What? But I scribbled.
I'll try my best.
And it could be that that becomes, yeah, I guess Wednesday is our cleanup day for
It is.
everything, so, okay.
I had one question. How does the Lawrence Urban Ag ordinance fit into all of this? Because there's no reference to it at all.
Perfectly.
We have no reference
Or
to
they,
it.
like,
Should we reference it in here?
So, I believe that, 3.4, as recommended by the Food Policy Council, is a high-level example of where the land development code, in which the Urban Ag Text Amendment was integrated, is more the implementing policies of that. So the broad, high-level comp plan language of expand integration of food production within communities. Urban ag is an example of that, but how you integrate it needs to be governed through property maintenance and zoning and use standards and those sorts of things that were a lot of discussion a few years ago.
Quite a bit.
Have we done all the damage we can on section E, food systems development? Okay, we will have at least a short discussion about this again on Wednesday. Back to C, community facilities. Anything on the sidebars of which we have only photos? Yay. How about the vision statement? Goal number 1? I actually have nothing flagged on this section at all. Go ahead,
Something
Commissioner
to add.
Ashworth.
1.5.
Mm-hmm.
Wondering if we could have something like incorporate lead elements into facility planning and design, or something along that line, so that when we build these new facilities, they're energy, water efficient.
Can we hear from staff on that? Do we have that anywhere else?
I didn't know if maybe that was incorporated somewhere else, but I was just looking through here, and we have multimodal transportation other places too, so,
Mhm.
just in elements of facility planning and design could include lead elements.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a value that belongs in the plan as an aspiration. It always becomes just a cost issue, but we need to
But as
be
an
leaders on that.
aspiration.
Yeah. I'm thinking if we didn't do something with this in chapter 6. 1 by 2, and on page 60, 6.5, under the goal, strengthen environmental protection through sustainable development of the built urban environment, promote sustainable building practices by leading and promoting green building standards and practices, and by creating incentives and reducing barriers to improve opportunities for distributed generation of renewable energy sources. I think, Sharon, this was a lot of language that you had presented. But still, I mean, it could show up here as well. You know, the municipalities, city and county, have opportunities on the public side that may not be present on the private side in terms of leading on energy efficiency, leading on historic preservation, leading on green infrastructure.
That's why they call it
So I
LEED.
think we should aspire to those things, even if at the end of the day, it doesn't always happen 100% of the time.
So how would you like to see that written?
It could just mirror some of the language. I already forgot what was in that 6.1 that you're talking about. It wasn't incorporating LEED as an LEED specifically,
right.
but the green building standards.
So look toward that
Yeah.
for some language.
And you would have that as a 1.5?
Yes.
Okay. People in agreement with that?
Sure.
Anything else on goal number 1? Commissioner Payton?
I don't know this under goal number 1, but it's probably is. Something I noticed or feel like is missing is when you talk about multimodal transportation here, but we've talked so much about infill, and I feel like there's nothing sort of directing us to consider community facilities, consider infill opportunities for community facilities. So I don't know if that would be appropriate to consider or
For
add
infill
or.
opportunities?
Yeah. Just feels like sometimes we kind of miss that. And a lot of our new community facilities sort of end up, we're not leading in that sense. They sort of end up on the edge. I mean, that picture, for one.
Did you have a language suggestion?
Consider infill opportunities for new community facilities or something like that. I don't know if it needs to have more or something other than opportunities. I mean, I think that can play into, I don't know if I want to change that at all, but that can play into the multimodal transportation elements. It's always going to be easier to have multimodal transportation if you have a, more compact city.
Can I add to that, we consider infill opportunities and possibly reuse opportunities
Yes, sounds
for
great.
community facilities?
Yep.
Would that be a 1.6?
It might go with 2,
Where are we?
since it's using locational
Okay.
criteria.
I think that's a
Yeah,
better.
consider following locational criteria when setting community, yeah, maybe 2.
2.4, we have a recommendation for 2.4, which would be consider both infill opportunities and reuse opportunities for community facilities.
Before we make that 2.4,
Uh-huh.
do we need 2.3? Because that 2.3 jumps out as code more than anything else I've read in the whole plan. And this is already a requirement of the development code, so
That's
does it
true.
really need to be here? So maybe this is strike 2.3 and substitute.
Mhm.
I think we've said it better maybe at 2.1 about minimizing impacts. That could be all impacts.
I think that's a good call. So we have a recommendation to strike 2.3 and instead add the language about infill and reuse. Does that sound okay? Goal number 3. At the hospital. What kind of support do we give to the community's hospital?
The code actually provides some level of support in how we've defined hospital. And this actually, the hospital has a history as our community hospital. Every now and then there's cycles of competition that rears its head. And so we have taken a stand in Horizon 2020 that we wanted to carry over that we wanted to be sure to reflect strong community support for the community hospital. Not that competition may or may not come, but it would be reflected that we are going to support it through both partnerships that we have with the hospital, that others have with the hospital, and as well as land use support in our codes.
Okay. Does anybody have any additions, changes, recommendations on goal number 3? Anything else on community facilities? Okay, moving on to D, arts and culture. Sidebars, advisory boards. How about the vision statement? Any comments? Goal number 1. This is another one we have implement the goals of the citywide cultural plan in the development process, and I think we need to use kind of the similar language that we value the work of those entities, but that they are not themselves the law of the land yet. Anything else on goal number 1? Goal number 2? Commissioner Carter.
The introductory statement to goal number 2, with a well-developed community of artists and activities, I would suggest changing activities to performers. There's nothing in this section that calls attention to the performing arts. Arts are defined in a really vague way, kind of pseudo-visual. There's visual arts and there's celebration, and there's no attention drawn to the fact that performers are artists and that they require infrastructure and space to support that.
And my comments actually caveat very nicely with yours, so I'm glad you opened it up with that. This section in here, and I've tried to interpret it as loosely as possible, doesn't say anything for cultural programming. To your point, celebrations, I think, I don't know if, I've tried to read it in such a way as to interpret that, but I can't find myself to do that. So I'd like to see something that in 2.1, because throughout this section it's arts and culture, and I think that's fine, but then there's the cultural role, which lends itself to populations and communities, that is still artful and brings benefit to everyone to go to these events and witness these things. But it's not to me, it's distinctively different than saying arts and culture. So I've encouraged, part and parcel with the 2.1 develop strategies for public-private partnerships. I'd like to incorporate some kind of language, or I'd like to hear what everybody else thinks about, that creates new opportunities for innovative cultural programming, or celebrating indigenous cultural programming, or something along those lines. Not sure entirely where I want it to go yet.
So something different from how 2.1, which does include cultural programming, but it's under the context of public-private partnerships. You're talking about something different than that.
Well, so I think in section 2, it talks about unique arts atmosphere, and I think that's pulling back on the yoke a little bit too high. If we're talking about a 40,000-foot view, I really feel this is about an 80 or 100,000-foot view, where certainly a powwow, you could fold that into an arts and cultural programming. But I think it's significant enough, especially in Douglas County and Lawrence, with Haskell being a resident here, to maybe add a little extra emphasis to cultural programming, and not to exclude all other cultures by just specifying indigenous cultures, but All cultural programming.
Any suggestions for how we do that, especially around land use?
Well, and that's the other part of it is, these are, and I understand that this is around incorporating, or it feels to me, I interpret it as, it's incorporating built art spaces primarily into public spaces or open areas, but, and I get that's specifically a land use issue, but it's supposed to be a comprehensive plan that kind of goes beyond land use, right, Scott? In a way?
Well, I would say that on things like where we have the cultural plan and the food policy plan and transportation plan, we've tried to be less is more. Providing the link to the full plan so that with one click, you're at the entirety of the plan. Calling out a few of the high-level land use components, because again, this plan is serving the planning commission and governing bodies in a land use capacity, not necessarily a programming of the arts capacity. Whereas the cultural art plan itself over here could serve the city commission when a programming issue comes up. It wouldn't necessarily be something the planning commission would be involved with. That was our approach, I guess, when we built this. And, you know, you've clearly had a advisory board take the time to provide you some more details in the food policy plan and change that discussion a little bit over here, but you haven't had that from the Lawrence Cultural Arts Commission. So I don't know if what you're saying aligns completely with the cultural arts plan, for example. Without studying it more and maybe getting some insight from the commission.
Yeah, and I'll be honest with you, it's one area that I really haven't dug into.
Can I make a suggestion? It's not very strongly land use oriented, but if on 2.1, we'd just left it at develop strategies for public-private partnerships for the arts, which is all forms of art, and then had a 2.2, which is prioritize cultural programming in civic life.
Yeah, I think those are, for the mess I gave you, I think that's pretty good.
And is there any objection to my specific edit about changing activities to performers?
No, I didn't have any. I thought it was
Well,
good.
I agreed with it as well, yeah.
I would follow up on David's comment that we might also include something about consumers of the arts. We have a very art, loving community here, supporters and patrons of the arts. I think, we have a huge community of people upon whom these performers rely to consume and go to their shows, buy their works, see them on the street. So
Would you say with a well-developed community of artists, performers, and patrons?
patrons of the arts.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah.
Building on these assets helps create a stronger vision and place for the arts in our community. I think that's probably well placed. And that's where much of the funding comes from.
On new 2.2, prioritize cultural programming
In civic life,
civic life.
yeah, that's open to suggestions. Anything else on goal number 2? Goal number 3? Weaving arts and cultural elements into development.
On goal 3.3, again, I would like to include the word performance somewhere in that, because again, there is the objective to design, maintain, and complement infrastructure for creative culture and celebratory activities. I might even just change celebratory to performance.
I think
Thinking of the major performance or celebratory activities that involve performance, for example, the Cultural Festival every year, which is done in the South Park gazebo, it is a terrible performance space. Because, it's one thing for the city band, when you're just listening to the music, But if the objective is to see performers, and you've got they're, first of all, they're elevated 15 feet above everybody else, and they are blocked from view by a railing, it's a terrible performance space. And I know part of the broader vision of the Sesquicentennial Commission back in 2004, along the Sesquicentennial Point, was to build an amphitheater.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know, I'll be honest, I haven't read the cultural plan, but at least providing for performance in the infrastructure in that phrase, I think would be good.
So for creative, cultural, and performance activities throughout
Yes.
the community, I would accept that.
Cool.
Anybody else?
So do we want to add something in there about, and maybe in 3.3, design, maintain, and complement seems to be very City of Lawrence and Douglas County specific. But we've got institutions within the city that are probably doing more to design, maintain, and complement infrastructure than probably the city or the county has available. Do we want to change that, or public-private tip of the cap to public-private partnerships, or public-public partnerships?
In my opinion, it's like 2.1 already covers that, the private-public partnerships, and I think having some allowance, even as they call it, complementary allowance for that kind of infrastructure that is open to the public as opposed to controlled by a private institution, is something worth at least mentioning.
Okay.
Do we have any other comments on arts and culture? And we finished one of our 2 chapters for tonight. The other chapter being the appendix. Do we want a break before we discuss the appendix, or do we want to push forward? We'll push forward then. What?
2 breaks? Already had 2 breaks.
So within our appendix, the portion A, community profile, all of these numbers, Jeff, am I right? They will be updated with the next census. They're not anything we need to be especially attentive to at this time. They will.
Yeah. We'll get those when the 2020 census comes out and revise them as they change.
Okay. And this was all part of our very original report that we had from staff about our community. Are there any comments, questions on this community profile portion? Specific land use plans. This is just a list of land use plans that we have currently on file, and we don't have any pending land use plans, do we?
We do not.
Okay.
I do have a quick question, though.
Sure.
Is there a priority list for updating these plans? Would that be part of a comprehensive plan? Is a strategy for what to prioritize for updating as the comp plan is adopted?
It works its way into that discussion about priorities after adoption. We've done a lot of planning work over the years. The city has, well before Jeff and I got here, right? And sometimes those come out of date, like it was in 2020. So after adoption, we'll get back into an annual effort with you all to look at what the priorities are going to be. In fact, I'm building a memo to the city commission that I'll share with you that talks a little bit about this whole thing.
Okay.
So you'll have a little bit more information on that after a little while here.
So when we determine our work plan or our work priorities for the year, that could include updating certain sector plans or other topics that we'll get to in the implementation.
Right, it may be establishing a brand-new neighborhood plan. It may be revising an existing neighborhood plan. It could be taking on a new corridor plan. or looking at putting some of these policies into our existing sector plans. There's a lot of work to be done, but a limited capacity for the ability to do that work.
So that was the specific area plans. Section C are the reference plans, and
Madam
we.
Chair, if I could go
Yes.
back, just real quickly and ask Jeff, specifically, we have some general numbers about employment in this, in community profile information. Do we have information, I'm sure, I guess we do, about the number of people employed at like the top employers in the county and the city? And kind of a breakdown of how many people are at hospital, KU, school district?
We occasionally will get those numbers, but they all depend on the entities releasing the various numbers to me. It's one of the harder ones to track. We can track it by profession, but not necessarily always by employer. Part of the problem with that data set now is a lot of people are considered independent contractors, so while they are employed by that organization, they don't show up on their rolls as that. Great example would be Uber. Would be one of your higher endorsed probably entities working in the city, but they don't technically have any employees yet.
I'm sorry, who?
Uber.
Oh, Uber, yeah.
So it's changed how the workplace handles those contracts, kind of changes that number, so it's hard to hone in on that annually.
Thanks. Okay.
I will draw your attention, if I may. Page 84, this was a steering committee discussion in terms of demographics on the population density per square mile. There was a discussion about support for policies that try to intensify the infill opportunities, and that data was to be shown here. And so we've got data on the density per square mile and how it peaks, as we get into close to 50s, and then how suburban happened the decades after that. And we got less and less dense the wider spread out we got. So I just wanted to, it's sort of the substantive component of this chapter to support some of the policies related to density.
So what is the Goldilocks metric for population density per square mile?
I don't think there is one. I think
35,
what
right?
this gives us is a track record, right? To say, when were we our most dense, when are we our least dense, and then we can talk about why and whether we want to keep that trend. You may say, great, feels great. This is the density we want. Maintain 2,574 people per square mile. That's our goal. But it's not. Our goal has been to want to try to intensify people per square mile for around some planning values.
Which kind of, in my mind, begs the question of, when we talk about infill, we're always talking about the most dense part of the city. So how do we infill and increase density out in the west of Iowa, or with these large lots with the big
Well,
houses on them?
Our opportunity may exist west of K-10 now,
Yeah.
in this next planning period.
Accessory dwelling units.
Huh?
Accessory dwelling units.
Well, you did see some of that with the redevelopment and at Jayhawk Club, for example.
6 in Queens? No.
6 and Queens.
It's not open yet.
Talk to the people that live out there.
They're landscaping, though.
So, I always look at that, though, as kind of a conundrum, especially in Lawrence, because you have something like when Bella Sarah came along. It's denser, but it's still it's like high-density sprawl. So it's very dense, but it's car-oriented. And to me, that's like kind of the worst of both both worlds, because then you have everybody who's driving and either not willing or not able or concerned enough that they won't bike or walk or whatever, and the walkability is not there. So in Bella Sarah, everybody's going to get in their car and drive to the grocery store because there isn't even a grocery store close enough to walk. So it's like, how do you get, and that's what I always feel like I wish I had something to look at somewhere that was a good example of that. But how do you get from that to something people enjoy and want to live in that's got those amenities and
You're
isn't
exactly
dependent
right,
on the car?
because it's not just densify,
Yeah.
it's densify in a context that maybe is transit-oriented and multimodal and mixed use and walkable. It's all of those things.
And how do you get from one to the other without it being just a total train wreck? And that's what I'm never,
Well, I
real
think
clear on.
what it will entail, I do think one of the priorities we're going to have before us is to get into the West of K-10 plan, for example, and really take a hard look at what outcomes we're gonna get if we stick with that plan today. Because I think we're more likely to get what you're talking about than what this plan aspires to. Unless you take into account the smart code plan, of which there was an alternative land use plan out of the smart code effort that had a much more walkable, mixed-use environment, you know, so, I mean, that's what we need to get into after we do this much,
Mhm. Plenty of work left to do,
yes.
if ever we can finish this work.
Yes.
Reference plans, we do have some placeholders for plans that are either in the works or have been discussed. Maybe we just have the one. No, we have a couple of we have a placeholder for the downtown Lawrence master plan, a placeholder for the affordable housing strategic plan. We don't have one for the climate adaptation plan that's been referenced even tonight, that I saw.
The reference plans, they only were put placeholders in there when the plans were ongoing or already initiated by a governing body.
Okay.
So that's why they're holding in that position at the moment.
Mhm.
We do actually have the affordable housing one in the red line. We have it kind of updated a little bit, but the
Mhm.
framework for that was it had to be initiated by a governing body to come into
Okay.
that reference.
Okay, so that is yet to be initiated, even though we've discussed it in here. Any comments, other comments or questions on the reference plans, which of course we've all read all of them? And this brings us to the section that I've really struggled with how we tackle, which is the implementation section. I think it's really important. This is where we're gonna measure what progress we're making on things. This is where we're going to draw our work plan from, for our priorities from year to year. It's also without looking at, we don't necessarily need every line item in the implementation plan, but we need to have those key things that we're likely to get to in the near future. And of course, reading through it in the paper copy that I've been editing all along is no good at all. You have to go back to the red line version because we've changed the wording on so many of these items that now have come to us. So I think as we've kind of looked through this, it's easier to look for the sins of commission, things that are here that maybe we don't need or don't want, than it is to see these sins of omission, which is there are things that maybe we talked about that haven't gotten yet into the implementation plan we want to see. That's a lot harder to find. And it may be that we will discuss anything that people have flagged on their own, but that may be something that we also just, as our homework between now and Wednesday, look through just the red line version and compare and see if there are any things that we've missed in the appendix that ought to be in implementation. So, Commissioner Ashworth, did you have a comment or, okay, so who has flagged something, preferably from the red line version, that we should talk about within the implementation chapter?
And
Yes.
Chair, can I offer just a little bit more about
Sure.
this? Because this chapter sort of grew on us the more we talked about it.
I
in
think the
in
steering committee wanted to see everything in there, and we did need a little,
If you look really
Ambitious.
just at D, right, in the paragraphs under the beginning of this, it talks about what its purpose is. It's simply to track and monitor the progress on all the work that we are likely to do over the 20 years to implement the plan. In hindsight, maybe we as staff shouldn't have put anything in this, okay? Because you haven't decided priorities yet. So we almost immediately began talking about priorities to implement when we, we're really just hadn't even established the policies. So what this really is intended, so there's a couple different ways to think about it. You could either do some work to say, yeah, this is a pretty good framework, and we know that the very first thing we have to do is go in here and establish our priorities. And remember, we're not talking about 30 things to tackle the first year. We're probably talking about a handful of things to tackle the first year, even though all these things will exist. So our real intent was to show you example about, in chapter 2, there's growth management, and that may be even a bad one, but
Something easy.
something that's going to have a status of either it didn't get initiated, it's completed, or it's in progress, so that after specific actions are taken, we can monitor and report out those actions. Because it might be that it got teed up, implementing a policy got teed up, stream buffer yards. Okay, we're going to present you a text amendment of stream buffer yards. Denied. It gets denied, so our status that year in our annual report is not, proposed for initiation and not initiated. After 10 years, we're going to say, well, why didn't we do stream buffers? Well, we did. We took a stab at it. Maybe we'll do it again. So it wasn't intended to have a large discussion at this time before the plan's adopted. It was intended to set up a framework so that we can take your priority efforts and track them.
Is it better to have this framework as it is, or is it better to just go back to the entire plan and draw our work from that?
Well, when we present you with a work plan, it will be the entire document you can draw from.
Mhm.
So it won't just be this implementation chapter, but it seemed like through the steering committee work that people were giving weight to things by putting it back here as if we were only going to limit ourselves to these items. And I don't believe that. That's not the perspective that we recommend you take.
So I hate to say this, but is it better not to have an implementation chapter, or, to have it, but have it be blank until we start filling in those work items?
That is an alternative, an option for you. I think it got sort of completed as the steering committee talked, so that they were the ones that were likely to be drawn from.
Mhm.
And I do think the steering committee intended that at the end of 20 years, most of these would have a status.
Okay.
And many of them can, and some of them aren't necessarily action steps. Some of them are, whether we preserve sensitive lands through specific land use plans, for example, we could, after a few years, audit our land use plans and say, yeah, we're doing a pretty good job, or, we're not doing such a good job. We let some things go over here. So I would recommend, based on what my understanding of the steering committee was to keep it as is, but I don't think you limit yourself on prioritizing work.
Okay. Yeah, certainly there was a lot of emphasis on it at the steering committee, and it would be maybe not our role to then pull that entirely. Yes.
I get the impression that it was an attempt to set up an example of a work plan, when really that's something that still has yet to be done.
Yes.
I think it quickly became that discussion, but it was also, the second part of that was to monitor policies over time and report on them. So, because some of the policies aren't going to have action verbs starting with it, right? It's just to make sure we,
Can we just kind of add a sentence under D before the chapter 2 part that just kind of states that this is a moving target here. So just, these are, the following represents action items that have been discussed. None have been set. This is the portion of the plan that will be modified on a yearly basis, something like that. And we can, and then we can highlight the ones that are set for current action. And that way we don't lose these, because there's a lot of good things in here that I know we're not gonna get to very soon. But if we take them out, we're gonna forget them, unless somebody walks in and says, we want this item again. Let's keep them as placeholders, like we have placeholders in the plan for, plans that are working, but have some way to highlight which ones for each chapter that are been identified for this year's work or something.
Commissioner Sands?
So, I just have a question. The appendix counts as part of the comprehensive plan, right?
Yes.
So to change the appendix would require a comprehensive plan amendment?
It would, but our plan would be to do that through our annual report process.
So then you wouldn't necessarily have to initiate a comp plan amendment just to change an
No,
annex?
so let's say that you want, as part of the work plan, through the planning commission, city commission, and county commission, we end up with a text amendment initiated for stream buffer. Even if it's not here, at the time a year has gone by, we're back in this, we said, oh, we've worked with that policy, we would place it back here, report on its status, and it would become part of our monitoring of Plan 2040.
Okay, so action items that get initiated
Would get
or
integrated
work
back
through
into here.
would just kind of be edited in, just
Right.
eased in, okay. Because my next question was then gonna be, whose comprehensive plan is it? As in, who sets the priority for work? So I could see it interpreted one of two ways. One in which the planning commission with the city and county governing bodies have to come together to say, these are the things that we all agree, not literally come together, but these are the things that we all agree we want to work on in a 3-year, 5-year, whatever, smaller chunk, similar to what the city commission does for a strategic plan.
Right.
Or it is things that maybe the planning staff recommends and says, based on this, we recommend tackling these things first, and like you said, it becomes a yearly thing, but that's more driven from the planning side solely than it is by the two governing bodies.
Well, before we started this, I had a pretty good practice of taking a work plan, some items to the planning commission, city commission, and county commission, informational, but also open it up to their input. And now, it would be that on steroids now that we're looking at a new comprehensive plan. And it's gonna be tougher because of the capacity, right? And so, and it may make a little more sense when I share the memo that I'm going to provide the city commission, because it revolves around some comments of the last city commission, where the city commission is hungry to provide some input and direct the planning office on community priority initiatives, right? But they may or may not be connected to Plan 2040. They're more stem from neighborhood issues and neighborhood initiatives. And so it may be that part of our work plan next year is doing neighborhood plans under the umbrella and the policies of this plan. So they'll still have the connection, but it won't be implementing this plan the way you all may think we're implementing the plan in the first year. But remember, it's a long time horizon, and we're still implementing Horizon 2020, right? And as that evolves and changes. So I think that's the discussion. But yeah, our intent is to bring you the work plan each year and provide you updates on where we're at with things. You'll know anyway, I mean, just through the normal course of things. You'll be part of a lot of what we do, but it also may be reporting out on what others are doing. As the Sustainability Office is working through the Climate Adaptation and Mitigation Plan, that was the term you actually gave it, by the way. Planning Office will likely be involved in that, but it may be led by that office. That becomes the annual report item on the status of that policy, back here in the implementation chapter.
So then how attached are we to the phrase in D, the last sentence there, the Planning Commission, Board of County Commissioners, and City Commission will prioritize the action items as they deem appropriate? Because I I feel like we're not solely, with the way you described it, we're not solely on that phrase. I mean, we are in the sense that you're the planning director for the joint activity.
Right, but you will deem it with staff and public input, like so many things, you will make a determination what's appropriate.
Okay.
And frankly, I mean, I think it's too, ultimately, we all take direction from the governing bodies.
Sure.
As the joint planning office, right, and the joint planning commission. So I think ours is a recommendation to you, is a recommendation to the governing body, so that we're all within the framework of our roles and charges laid out by the documents that lay out our responsibilities. In the past, there's been high level of participation by the planning commission, and I think that will continue. But I think ultimately it has to be, even our work plan has to be sort of alignment with all three of the commissions that are involved with this.
Commissioner Carter?
So, just looking at this, I'd like to take a minimally invasive approach to editing the section D. I think my biggest, one thing is the organization is a little bit confusing, because of course it reflects the sequence of all the items in the plan. So it gives the impression of being a set of priorities that's illusory. The other issue with it, as far as I'm concerned, is that some of the implementation steps seem to be just restatements of the goals. I mean, rather than...
They're all restatements.
Are they really?
They're
Basically,
exact
so,
copy.
so I guess so I have two questions. One, again, from the steering committee, like, can you give some idea of, like, what was the threshold for some, since everything is part of the plan, technically it should be implemented. What was the threshold for saying, oh, we should do this one, as opposed to we shouldn't do this one? That's my first question. My second question is, can you propose some kind of organization for the next step that will reflect how priorities are set?
I can take that a little from this steering
thank you.
committee. It won't be very helpful, just so you
It
know.
won't be.
Things that we liked, that we valued, we put forward. The steering committee doesn't get to set a work plan. They don't get to set those priorities. So it was just kind of a chance to say, hey, make sure that these three entities look at this, that, and the other. And it was a lot, because we valued so much of the work we were doing. As far as restructuring it in any way other than as it occurs in the document, I wouldn't, because that would give some kind of suggestion of a set of priorities, and I think that that will change year by year and for each of the bodies that looks at this.
Okay.
So I think the framework as it is, even though it's a little hairy and it's certainly full, but knowing that we as an entity can look at any aspect of the plan and prioritize that for implementation, I think we just have to keep that in mind, that these are all worthy things to be tracking and working on. We won't get to them all anytime soon, but it was a first pass.
And I would just add that even, not only that, it was that monitoring component as well. Maybe there wasn't any action to be had. There were some on the steering committee that just said, this is worth tracking over time to make sure that we have some data against this policy. We may not have to do anything but track whatever policy it was.
I would kind of argue against changing anything. I mean, it's a good set of ideas.
Yeah.
And like I said, we're gonna start recommending what we think should happen, and we'll see what the city and county commissions say we do first. But
I think
some of them are gonna be in a logical order. Like, we need to, hit this item before we can even do these items, but that's gonna work itself out. I guess we could add things if we wanna add them, but I would argue against removing any right now.
I didn't have any suggestions for changes in this chapter, believe it or not. Did you have further comments,
No.
Commissioner Carter?
No,
Any other further comments on the implementation portion. So, before you start thinking we're done, we do have at our Wednesday meeting, we have kind of just a handful of items that Jeff has been keeping track of things that we said, we'll come back to that, we'll come back to that.
Do you have that list? So we could maybe think about them?
We can probably send that between now and then. But, so, we'll leave those for your consideration. Some of them minor, some of them, well, anyway. So, but we have actually gotten through the entire document so far, and we will have our regular meeting on Wednesday, and then have just that cleanup day where we'll look at some of those items, where we'll be going back and looking at should things be plugged in different places and that sort of thing.
Yeah, and really your homework, since you have the red line version now,
Mhm.
is, I think, each one of you have proposed different things. Go in, check the things maybe that you were wanting change, make sure it's to your satisfaction. And then we can share with you kind of the list that we're gonna have questions for you. Say, well, you kind of left wages in this chapter kind of on the table. We think here's what we did with it. Are we there yet? And so that's, I think, gonna be the discussion we wanna have with you Wednesday.
And then we will take a vote on Wednesday, but we do not yet have
You don't
the
have,
official resolution
right.
in hand.
So we will have to bring that back to you in June. And then also, if there are some changes that you make Wednesday in your motion, if we get to the motion, we'll also have to make those. So I do think June, you'll be there. You will have done made your decision, I think, Wednesday, but the formal adoption happens probably in June. We will be working, if you make a motion and pass it on Wednesday, we will be working to schedule it as immediately as we can with the city commission to get it in their process.
And a heads up to everybody, we're talking about only having a Monday meeting in June and
Yes.
not doing the Wednesday. Yeah, isn't that tough? And our chair is otherwise occupied on that Wednesday, so that she can finish up what she's led us through. We've talked about doing it on the Monday and doing this first.
So, thank you.
So does that mean we're gonna start earlier?
No, we'll start at 6:30 on Monday.
We don't have too healthy, I think, of a night that set up for June.
We do have 2 miscellaneous items on our agenda. The first, residential lot inventory report. I believe we are just accepting this report as it was in our packet, and we will have a mid-month on it
Correct.
coming up shortly, I think July.
Sounds right. I'd have to look.
And no other action, or do we have to?
No.
Okay. And miscellaneous item number 2, the affordable housing article that was included in our packet also. We're just receiving that item
Yeah.
that everyone has already seen.
That was just an article I thought was a robust discussion of topics that you and the Affordable Housing Board, the City Commission are all kind of going through. We see articles every once in a while that we try to share, and I thought that was an interesting debate of it. So it's a little bit long, but if you can find time to read it, I think it would interest you.
It was a relatively minor part of our 472-page packet.
Yes.
Do we have any other items to discuss, any other business?
I don't think so.
Potential quorum of this body after our Wednesday meeting at Free State, I believe, so.
Yes. Yes, so
Everybody
you do
plan
need to make
accordingly.
that motion we talked about, yes.
we-
So you do need to make that motion we talked about a minute ago on the comp plan, so we can get to our
Yes, otherwise we don't get to go.
post-event,
Yeah,
right?
that's right. That's only if we finish do we get to go. Seeing nothing else, I'd say we adjourn.
No, stand in recess.
We recess. We will recess until Wednesday. Thank you, Vice Chair.